My grandson handed me a tiny blue pill and asked a question that froze the blood in my veins. "Grandpa, why does Grandma only make me take these vitamins when you are not around?" I looked at the pill in his small hand and I knew right then that the people I called family were hiding a dark, deadly secret. My name is Raymond. I am 69 years old. For 40 years, I built a construction empire from the ground up, providing everything my family could ever want. I thought I had secured our legacy. I thought my grandson was safe. But that afternoon in the kitchen, the illusion of my perfect life was shattered. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that true family is about loyalty and protection, not greed. The house was quiet that afternoon. Sunlight streamed through the large bay windows, illuminating the spotless granite countertops of the kitchen I had paid for with my own sweat. I was standing by the sink pouring a glass of cold water after a long walk in the yard. My 10-year-old grandson Tommy walked in. He dragged his feet slightly, a sluggishness that had become far too common over the past few weeks. He looked around the empty living room, making sure the coast was clear before he approached me and tugged at my sleeve. He asked if he could ask me something. His voice was barely a whisper. I knelt down to his eye level, noticing the dark circles under his beautiful brown eyes, and told him, of course. He reached into the pocket of his denim jeans and pulled out a small, unmarked blue pill. He asked why Grandma made him take these vitamins when I was not around. He said she told him they would make him strong, but they just made him feel weird. My heart skipped a beat. I took the pill from his palm. It felt heavy, like a lead weight dropping into my stomach. It had no letters, no brand markings, nothing that indicated it was a child's daily vitamin. Sylvia, my wife of 40 years, was supposed to be the loving matriarch of this family. Why would she be forcing our grandson to take unidentified medication in secret? I asked him what he meant by weird. He rubbed his eyes, looking exhausted despite it being the middle of the afternoon. He told me his head gets all foggy and he feels sleepy all the time. He said his teacher asked if he was getting enough sleep because he kept putting his head on the desk at school, and sometimes he felt dizzy when he stood up fast. I kept my expression perfectly calm. As a man who had negotiated cutthroat construction deals for decades, I knew exactly how to hide my panic. I patted his shoulder, giving him a reassuring smile, and told him not to worry. I promised I would talk to Grandma and make sure we got him the right vitamins, then sent him to play in his room for a bit. As soon as he disappeared up the wooden stairs, the calm facade melted away. My blood ran cold. Sylvia was sneaking pills to the boy behind my back. I grabbed my keys and walked out to my truck. I did not say a word to Sylvia, who was sitting out on the back patio sipping iced tea. I just started the engine and drove. My destination was the clinic of Dr. Aris Thorne. Aris was an old friend, a man I trusted with my life. He had been my personal physician for 20 years, and he was completely removed from the toxic web of my family. The drive across town felt like an eternity. My mind raced, piecing together the subtle changes I had noticed over the past month. Tommy used to be a vibrant, energetic kid playing baseball in the yard and constantly asking a million questions about how buildings were made. Lately, he had become a ghost of his former self. He stared blankly at the television. He barely touched his favorite foods. And then there was my son Terrence and his wife Megan. Megan was a white woman who always carried a subtle, underlying arrogance. She smiled at my face, but I always saw the cold calculation in her eyes. Terrence was weak, a man who had never built anything of his own, relying entirely on my wealth and bending to Megan's every whim. Recently, Megan had been complaining loudly about Tommy's behavior. She kept telling everyone that the boy was becoming unmanageable, that he might have a severe behavioral disorder. I had brushed it off as a mother overreacting or seeking attention. Now, gripping the leather steering wheel of my truck, the puzzle pieces began to form a horrifying picture. I pulled into the parking lot of the clinic and walked straight past the receptionist. Aris was in his private office reviewing some medical charts. He looked up, ready to scold whoever had walked in without knocking, but when he saw my face, his expression changed instantly. He asked what was wrong. I closed the heavy oak door behind me and locked it. I walked over to his desk and placed the small blue pill on the glass surface. I told him I needed to know exactly what this was, and I needed to know right now. Aris picked up the pill with a pair of silver tweezers. He examined it under the bright halogen light on his desk. He frowned, turning it over, noting there were no identifying numbers on it. He asked where I got it. I explained that my grandson handed it to me, and that his grandmother had been secretly forcing him to take it, telling him it was a vitamin. Eris looked at me, his professional demeanor shifting into deep concern, and asked what symptoms the boy was showing. I listed them off: extreme lethargy, dizziness, brain fog. I told him the boy is 10 years old but walks around like a sedated hospital patient. Eris did not say another word. He placed the pill into a small plastic vial and told me to wait. He said he was going to run a rapid chemical analysis in the back lab, which would take about 15 minutes. Those 15 minutes were the longest of my 69 years on this earth. I paced the length of the office. Every step echoed the betrayal that was clawing at my throat. I had built a massive legacy to protect my bloodline. I provided the luxury roof over their heads, and in return they were doing something unspeakable to an innocent child. My own wife was complicit. My own son was blind or worse involved. The door opened and Eris walked back in. His face was entirely drained of color. He sat down heavily in his leather chair and looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. He said my name. I demanded he tell me what it was. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "This is not a vitamin, this is risperidone." The medical name meant nothing to me. I demanded he explain it in plain English. Eris took a deep breath, rubbing his temples. He explained that it is a very powerful antipsychotic medication typically prescribed for adults with severe schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or extreme manic episodes. He said the dosage in this single pill is massive, strong enough to knock out a fully grown man. I stopped pacing. The air in the room seemed to vanish. An antipsychotic for a healthy 10-year-old boy. I asked what happens if a child takes this regularly. Eris leaned forward, his voice thick with clinical anger. He said it heavily suppresses the central nervous system, causing severe drowsiness, weight gain, and cognitive impairment. He told me that if someone has been giving this to Tommy daily, they are chemically lobotomizing him. They are intentionally suppressing his brain function to make him appear mentally unstable or severely disabled. He warned that a dose this high could cause permanent neurological damage if it continues. The reality of his words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. They were intentionally making my grandson look mentally impaired. But why? What could they possibly gain from destroying the mind of their own flesh and blood? Before I could even process the magnitude of this evil, the phone in my pocket vibrated violently. It was a motion notification from the smart security system I had installed at my house. I pulled out the phone and opened the camera application. The live high-definition feed showed the front porch of my home. My daughter-in-law Megan was walking up the steps. She looked around nervously, checking over her shoulder to make sure the driveway was empty. Tucked tightly under her arm was a thick manila folder. A smirk played on her lips, a look of arrogant triumph. She reached up and pressed the doorbell. She had no idea I was watching her every move. She had no idea that I now held the medical evidence of her monstrous crime. The game was set, and they had just made a fatal mistake by underestimating the man who built everything they stood upon. The drive back to my neighborhood was a blur of calculated rage. I parked my truck 2 blocks down the street. I did not want the familiar roar of my engine announcing my arrival. I walked through the back alleyway and approached my own house like a burglar. I slipped my key into the back patio door, turning it with the precision of a man who spent 40 years working with his hands. The heavy door opened without a single sound. I stepped into the dim mudroom and let the shadows completely swallow me. From the formal dining room just beyond the kitchen, I heard the clinking of porcelain and the sharp, arrogant pitch of my daughter-in-law's voice. Megan was pacing. I could hear the rhythmic click of her expensive heels on the hardwood floor. Sylvia, my wife of 4 decades, sat at the table, offering a weak, pathetic murmur of agreement. Megan stopped pacing, and her voice dropped to a harsh whisper. She said, "The boy is still too alert, Sylvia. He was asking questions about the pills this morning. You need to up the dosage." I leaned against the cold plaster wall, my fists clenched so tight my knuckles ached. Sylvia let out a heavy sigh. She told Megan she was afraid of giving him too much. She said if they push it too far, the school nurse might notice something is seriously wrong and call Child Protective Services. Megan scoffed. She said she did not care about the school nurse. She said they were running out of time. Next month is the official medical evaluation. She stated clearly that if Tommy walks into that doctor's office looking like a normal functioning 10-year-old, this whole plan falls apart. We need him completely docile. We need him to look severely impaired. I held my breath. The sheer malice in her voice was suffocating. Megan slammed her hand against the dining table. The sound echoed through the quiet house. She told Sylvia to stop being a coward. She said they were talking about the $5 million trust fund. She said all they needed was one official medical diagnosis of severe cognitive disability, and the money would legally default to her and Terrence. Hearing those words out loud was like taking a bullet to the chest. The $5 million trust fund. 5 years ago, when my construction company had its most profitable quarter, I wanted to secure Tommy's future. I knew my son Terrence was financially irresponsible. He had failed at every business venture I ever funded. I knew Megan was driven entirely by greed. I refused to let the wealth I built with broken fingernails and sweat be squandered on their lavish lifestyles. So I locked the money away. I set up an ironclad trust fund exclusively for my grandson. The money was to be used only for his education and would fully transfer to him when he turned 25. But I made one fatal mistake. I listened to my lawyer, who insisted on adding a standard medical contingency clause. The clause stated that in the tragic event Tommy suffered a catastrophic mental impairment or was diagnosed with a severe cognitive disability rendering him incapable of eventually managing his own affairs, the control of the trust would immediately transfer to his legal guardians, his parents. It was a standard legal safety net designed for a tragedy. I never imagined it would be used as a blueprint for a slow, meticulous murder. Megan was not just complaining about a misbehaving child. She was orchestrating a calculated chemical lobotomy to trigger that exact legal clause. She was willing to destroy a 10-year-old boy's brain permanently to get her hands on $5 million. Sylvia poured more tea. Her voice was steady, lacking any maternal warmth. She told Megan to relax. She promised she would crush an extra pill into his orange juice tomorrow morning. She said Raymond is busy with his retirement projects and never notices a thing. The woman I had shared a bed with for 40 years, the woman who had helped me raise our son, was actively participating in the destruction of our grandson. I had spent my entire life building strong foundations, protecting my family from the harsh realities of the world. Now the greatest threat was sitting at my own dining table drinking tea. I realized then that my wife was not a victim of Megan's manipulation. Sylvia was a willing accomplice driven by her own dark motivations. The sick realization washed over me. They were treating my grandson like a sacrificial lamb on the altar of their greed. Just as I braced myself to step out of the shadows and confront them, the front door chimed. Heavy footsteps echoed in the foyer. It was my son Terrence. He walked into the dining room loosening his expensive silk tie. He did not greet his wife or his mother. He immediately walked over to the kitchen island right on the edge of my line of sight. He pulled open a drawer and grabbed a handful of empty blister packs, the foil wrappers that had held the risperidone pills. He threw them onto the table in front of Sylvia. His voice was completely devoid of emotion. He told his mother she was getting sloppy. He said he found 2 empty pill wrappers at the bottom of the trash can without being properly concealed. He warned her that if his father saw them, he would start asking questions. Terrence leaned over the table, his face twisting into a cold sneer. He told Sylvia she needed to wrap the empty blister packs in paper towels and throw them in the outside garbage bin. He said his dad is an observant old man and they could not afford any mistakes right now, not when they were this close to the payout. The last shred of hope I had clinging to the desperate thought that my son was oblivious to this nightmare evaporated. Terrence was not blind. Terrence was not being manipulated by his wicked wife. My own flesh and blood, the boy I had raised to be a man, was the co-architect of this atrocity. He was actively covering up the poisoning of his own son. I looked at the 3 of them gathered around the table. My wife, my son, my daughter-in-law. They looked like a normal, affluent family discussing weekend plans, but beneath the designer clothes and the polished veneer they were absolute monsters. They had formed a unified syndicate of evil right under my roof. They were willing to sacrifice Tommy's mind, Tommy's future, and Tommy's life for a check. I felt a cold, hard resolve settle into my bones. I was no longer a husband. I was no longer a father. I was a protector, and I was going to crush them all. I slowly shifted my weight, intending to back out through the mudroom door and return to my truck. I needed time to gather my evidence. I needed to act strategically. But as I moved, my heavy leather boot pressed down on the edge of a loose oak floorboard. A loud, sharp creak echoed through the silent house. It sounded like a gunshot in the tense air. The conversation in the dining room stopped instantly. The silence that followed was suffocating. I froze, pressing my back flat against the wall, my heart hammering against my ribs. Terrence straightened up. His chair scraped harshly against the floor. He asked who was there. His voice was sharp, laced with sudden paranoia. He told Megan to stay put. I heard his heavy footsteps slowly moving away from the dining table. He was walking directly toward the dark hallway where I was hiding. The heavy footsteps grew louder. Terrence was only a few feet away from the shadow where I stood pressed against the wall. I held my breath, fighting the urge to step out and break his jaw, but I needed evidence. I reached into the deep pocket of my jacket and my fingers brushed against a heavy steel hex nut I had picked up from my workshop earlier. With a swift flick of my wrist, I tossed the chunk of metal down the opposite end of the hallway toward the laundry room. It hit the tiled floor with a sharp metallic clatter. Terrence stopped instantly and pivoted toward the noise. He called out, asking if anyone was there, and slowly walked toward the laundry room to investigate. That was all the window I needed. I slipped silently out the back door into the cool night air and walked the 2 blocks back to my truck. I did not sleep a single wink that night. At 6 in the morning, I was sitting in a rundown diner across town holding a cup of black coffee. Across from me sat Dexter Cole. Dexter was a private investigator, an ex-military intelligence officer who owed me a favor from years back when I helped him out of a tight spot. I told him I needed eyes and ears inside my own home immediately. I explained that I needed equipment so small and undetectable that a paranoid rat could not find it. Dexter did not ask unnecessary questions. He slid a black hard case across the table. He told me it contained military-grade microcameras with built-in audio receivers that feed directly to an encrypted application on my phone. I returned home around 10 in the morning. Sylvia was out at her weekly card game, and Terrence and Megan had taken Tommy to some indoor playground to keep up the appearance of a happy family. The house was completely empty. I grabbed my toolbox and went to work. 40 years in construction meant I knew every square inch of this house. I knew the blind spots, the structural hollows, and the best vantage points. I started in the kitchen. I took the ornate ceramic sugar bowl Sylvia kept on the center island, carefully drilling a microscopic hole near the decorative rim and slipping a camera lens no bigger than a grain of rice inside. I positioned it perfectly to capture the entire counter and the dining table. Next, I moved to the living room. I removed the steel grates of the air vents near the ceiling. I wired 2 more cameras directly into the structural framework, angling them to cover the seating areas and the main hallway. The installation took less than an hour, leaving absolutely no trace. I packed up my tools and retreated to my home office in the basement, locking the heavy door behind me. I synced the cameras to my phone. The high-definition feeds flickered to life on my screen. The audio was crystal clear. Now I just had to wait. I did not have to wait long. By early afternoon, the front door opened and the family returned. I sat in the glow of my monitors watching my own house like a hawk. Sylvia walked into the kitchen, dropping her purse on the counter. Megan followed close behind her, face tight with irritation. Through the audio feed, I heard Megan complaining bitterly. She said Tommy almost fell asleep on the slide today and it was embarrassing. She told Sylvia that people were staring. Sylvia whispered back that they needed to be careful. But Megan was ruthless. She leaned against the island right in front of the sugar bowl camera. She told Sylvia that careful was taking too long. She said the medical evaluation is in exactly 3 weeks. We cannot have him having a good day when the doctor tests his cognitive functions. We need to double the dose starting tomorrow morning. She said the lawyer assured her that once the severe impairment diagnosis is on paper, the trust fund transfers automatically. Sylvia hesitated, her voice shaking slightly as she asked if doubling it might make his heart stop. Megan rolled her eyes. She said the drug does not stop hearts, it just stops thoughts. She ordered Sylvia to stop whining and just do it. Hearing them coldly calculate the destruction of my grandson's mind over a casual afternoon conversation made my blood boil. I recorded every single second of it, saving the files to a secure cloud server. The evidence was mounting, but I needed the undeniable proof of the physical act. The next morning, I stayed down in my basement office, claiming I had a mountain of tax paperwork to sort through. In reality, my eyes were glued to the screen of my phone. It was breakfast time. The kitchen feed showed Sylvia standing by the stove flipping pancakes. Megan walked into the frame fully dressed in her sharp corporate attire. Tommy was sitting at the dining table looking exhausted, staring blankly at a bowl of cereal. I watched closely as Megan pulled a small plastic bag from her blazer pocket. The camera hidden in the sugar bowl captured everything in perfect, terrifying detail. She walked over to the kitchen counter, pulling out a small porcelain mortar and pestle. I zoomed in on the feed. She reached into the plastic bag and pulled out 2 of the unmarked blue pills, risperidone. She dropped them into the mortar and began grinding them down into a fine white powder. My jaw clenched so tight my teeth ground together. Megan poured a tall glass of fresh orange juice. She carefully swept the crushed powder into the glass and took a spoon to stir it vigorously until the powder completely dissolved into the orange liquid. She wiped the counter spotless, leaving no evidence behind. Sylvia glanced over her shoulder, saw what Megan was doing, and simply turned back to the stove, saying nothing. Megan picked up the glass, walked over to the dining table, and placed it right in front of Tommy. She smiled, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, as she told him to drink up all his juice so he could grow up big and strong. Tommy looked at the glass with hesitant, tired eyes. He reached out with trembling hands and lifted the glass to his lips. I had to force myself to stay seated in my chair. I wanted to smash through the basement door and flip the table, but I needed the trap to snap shut completely. Just as Tommy took his first sip, a sharp ring echoed from the front doorbell. Megan quickly took the glass away from Tommy, setting it back on the table, and rushed to the foyer. I switched my phone to the hallway camera feed. Megan opened the heavy mahogany door. Standing on the porch was a tall man wearing a sharp tailored suit carrying an expensive leather briefcase. He had slicked back hair and a confident, predatory smile. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. Terrence walked out of the living room to greet him, shaking his hand firmly. Megan closed the door and turned to her husband, telling him the doctor has arrived right on schedule. The man adjusted his tie and announced himself in a loud, authoritative voice, stating he was the behavioral psychologist here to conduct the preliminary cognitive evaluation on the boy. I watched the fake doctor perform his fabricated evaluation through the hidden cameras. He asked Tommy basic questions, but the boy was too heavily sedated from the morning juice to answer coherently. He asked Tommy to draw a clock on a piece of paper, but the boy could barely hold the pencil, letting it slip from his fingers. The fraud scribbled notes on his clipboard, shaking his head in mock sympathy, while Terrence and Megan played the roles of devastated, concerned parents. I recorded every single second of the performance, securing it in the encrypted cloud server. I stayed in my basement office long after the fake psychologist left the house. I needed to understand the mechanics of this betrayal. Why would Sylvia, a woman who had lived a life of absolute comfort and luxury, actively participate in destroying her own bloodline? The answer arrived later that evening. I had unlocked the exterior cellar doors, allowing Dexter Cole to slip into my basement completely unseen. Dexter moved with the silent grace of a ghost. The private investigator did not offer any pleasantries or warm greetings. He walked straight over to my heavy oak desk and threw a thick manila folder onto the polished surface. He looked at me with a grim expression and told me that my wife had been keeping dark secrets that were about to tear my entire world apart. I reached out and opened the folder. The first page was a comprehensive background check that shattered whatever lingering illusions I had left about my marriage. Sylvia was not acting out of misguided loyalty to our son or fear of Megan. She was acting out of pure, desperate self-preservation. I stared at the glossy photographs spilling out of the file. My hands felt completely numb. The photographs showed Sylvia sitting at dimly lit tables in underground gambling dens across the city. She was surrounded by stacks of chips, empty cocktail glasses, and incredibly unsavory characters. For years, she had told me she was going to her weekly bridge club with the wealthy neighborhood ladies. That was a pathetic lie. Dexter explained that Sylvia had developed a severe gambling addiction. She started small at local licensed casinos, but when she began losing heavily, she moved to underground illegal games. She hoped to win back her massive losses outside the watchful eyes of legal financial tracking. She failed completely. The financial ledgers Dexter obtained painted a horrifying picture. Sylvia had accumulated a staggering debt of $200,000. This was not money owed to a forgiving bank or a standard credit card company. She owed this massive fortune to a ruthless local crime syndicate known for breaking bones and burning down houses when they did not get paid on time. Dexter leaned against the concrete wall of the basement and explained the rest of the puzzle. He had managed to clone the data from Sylvia's personal cell phone. He pulled out a stack of printed text messages between Sylvia and Megan. Megan had discovered the massive gambling debt 3 months ago. But instead of coming to me to solve the problem, Megan saw the ultimate opportunity to secure a desperate accomplice. The printed messages laid out a sickening contract between my wife and my daughter-in-law. Megan promised Sylvia a massive cut of Tommy's trust fund. Megan wrote clearly that once the $5 million trust transferred to her and Terrence, she would secretly wire Sylvia $500,000. That amount would be more than enough to pay off the dangerous syndicate and keep Sylvia living her lavish, comfortable lifestyle. In exchange for this blood money, Sylvia had to do the dirty work. She had to be the one to physically mix the antipsychotic drugs into Tommy's food. She had to use her status as a trusted grandmother to ensure the boy swallowed the poison every single day. She was also tasked with keeping me distracted, ensuring I never looked too closely at Tommy's sudden cognitive decline. My own wife had officially agreed to sell her grandson's mind for $500,000 just to save her own skin from the mafia. The sheer depravity of the arrangement made my stomach churn, but Dexter was not finished. He tapped a specific financial audit document near the back of the folder. He told me that Sylvia was running out of time and the crime syndicate had grown incredibly impatient waiting for the supposed trust fund payout. They wanted a show of good faith immediately. Dexter pointed to a series of transactions tied directly to my exclusive black credit card. It was a high-tier corporate account I kept solely for emergency construction material purchases and massive company expenditures. The card was kept in a locked safe in my study. Sylvia must have memorized the combination years ago. Because the monthly balance was regularly enormous, I rarely scrutinized the line-by-line transactions myself, leaving that tedious job to my corporate accountant. Dexter highlighted 5 separate withdrawals and rapid wire transfers processed over the last 14 days. They were cleverly disguised as payments to independent contractors for home renovations and landscaping. They totaled exactly $50,000. Sylvia had stolen my card, forged my signature on the authorization forms, and siphoned the money right under my nose to make a massive interest payment to the mob. She used the wealth I built to protect our family to keep the thugs from breaking her legs while she continued to poison my grandson. I stared at the highlighted numbers on the paper, feeling a cold, dark fury completely consume my soul. Every dollar I had ever earned was built on 40 years of broken fingernails, late nights, and exhausting physical labor. I had provided a luxurious kingdom for my family. Now they were treating me like a blind bank vault and treating my grandson like disposable collateral damage. The financial loophole was glaring, and my accountant's failure to flag it was a problem I would definitely deal with later. Right now, the reality of my situation was stark and terrifying. My family was a den of vipers, and the poison was spreading faster than I ever realized. Dexter broke the heavy silence in the room. He warned me that the $50,000 was just a temporary band-aid. He said the syndicate bosses were greedy, and they knew Sylvia lived in a very wealthy neighborhood. They were tired of waiting for the full $200,000, and they were planning to accelerate their violent collection methods. Just as he finished speaking, the security application on my phone chimed loudly. It was not the front porch camera this time. It was the wide-angle street view monitor. I quickly picked up the phone and looked at the live high-definition feed. The blood froze completely in my veins. 2 heavily tinted matte black sport utility vehicles rolled to a slow, predatory stop right in front of my manicured lawn. The heavy engines cut off in perfect unison. The vehicle doors swung open and 4 massive men wearing cheap leather jackets and dark sunglasses stepped out onto the pavement. They looked around, scanning the perimeter of my property like wolves. The debt collectors had officially arrived at my front door. I watched the 2 matte black vehicles through the security feed. The 4 massive men did not approach the front door. One of them walked up to the mailbox, shoved a thick black envelope inside, and spat on the pristine concrete of my driveway. They got back into their vehicles and drove off into the night, leaving a silent but deadly warning. The syndicate was marking their territory. The timeline for my entire counterattack was shrinking rapidly. I told Dexter to keep monitoring the perimeter and sent him out the back entrance. My house had officially become a war zone, but I had one final personal mission to execute before I dropped the nuclear bomb on this wicked family. I needed to know if my son was completely lost, or if there was a single shred of humanity left inside him. The next evening I called Terrence. I told him we needed to grab a drink, just father and son, to discuss some family matters. We agreed to meet at an upscale whiskey lounge downtown, a quiet place with dark mahogany walls and leather booths far away from prying ears and hidden cameras. I arrived early, ordering a neat bourbon. I sat in the dim lighting, staring at the amber liquid and thinking about the boy I had raised. I remembered buying him his first baseball glove. I remembered staying up late to help him with his math homework when he was struggling. I had built an entire construction empire just so he would never have to know the feeling of an empty stomach or a cold house. I wanted to believe that Megan was the sole mastermind and that she had somehow deeply manipulated him into this horrific nightmare. I wanted to desperately believe my son was just a weak fool, not a calculated monster. When Terrence walked into the lounge adjusting his expensive designer watch and flashing his artificial practice smile, I felt a sharp, agonizing ache in my chest. I looked at the man he had become and decided to give him one final test. One last chance to act like a real father and save his own flesh and blood. Terrence slid into the leather booth across from me, signaling the waiter and ordering a premium scotch on my tab without even asking. He loosened his silk tie and asked what the occasion was, acting as if we were just two successful businessmen having a casual evening. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the heavy wooden table. I kept my voice low, heavy, with feigned grandfatherly concern. I told him I was deeply worried about Tommy. I explained that the boy was simply not acting right and that the changes were terrifying me. I described the severe lethargy, the blank, unblinking stares the way he stumbled in the kitchen the other day, as if he had lost all motor control. I said he looks like he is walking through thick mud, Terrence. He is 10 years old, but he has no energy to even play catch in the yard. He falls asleep sitting straight up and his eyes look completely hollow. I poured all my emotion into the performance, making sure he understood the gravity of my fake panic. I told him we needed to take Tommy to the Central Hospital downtown immediately for a comprehensive blood panel and a full neurological exam. I offered to pay for the absolute best pediatric specialists in the state. I said we need an independent expert to figure out what is draining the life out of that boy before it is too late. I laid the bait perfectly. If Terrence had a single ounce of genuine love for his child, he would have jumped at the offer. A real father, a man with a functioning soul, would move mountains and drain oceans to find out why his son was suddenly wasting away. He would have grabbed my hand, thanked me for the financial help, and rushed straight to the hospital. I watched his face closely, waiting for the panic of a concerned parent, or at least a flicker of guilt to cross his eyes. Instead, Terrence let out a loud, exasperated sigh. He took a slow, arrogant sip of his scotch and rolled his eyes in profound annoyance. He leaned back in his leather chair, completely relaxed, resting his arm on the backrest. He waved his hand dismissively, batting away my genuine concerns like a pesky fly. He told me I was overreacting. He lowered his voice, adopting a patronizing tone that made my skin crawl with absolute disgust. He lied straight to my face with zero hesitation. He said, "Tommy is just going through a difficult developmental phase, Dad. You are getting older and you just do not understand modern child psychology." Terrence looked around the lounge to ensure no one was listening before leaning in closer. He claimed that he and Megan had already spoken to top-tier private doctors. He stated with a perfectly straight face that Tommy had recently been diagnosed with severe congenital autism and early-onset behavioral degradation. He used big clinical words, trying to sound highly intelligent, completely unaware that I knew he was reciting a fabricated script written by his ruthless wife. He said the doctors at the Central Hospital would just poke and prod the boy for no reason, causing unnecessary trauma. He insisted that Tommy needed to be kept at home under Megan's strict specialized care routine. Hearing him legitimize the chemical lobotomy of his own child made me want to reach across the table and snap his neck. He was sitting there drinking expensive scotch paid for by my money while validating the daily poisoning of his own son. Terrence then reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a folded legal document. He smoothed it out on the table and pushed it toward me along with a heavy silver pen. He said Megan and he were struggling to manage the highly complex medical decisions required for Tommy's new cognitive condition. He told me that since I was the primary benefactor of Tommy's massive trust fund, the lawyers strongly recommended I sign this medical proxy waiver to streamline the process. It would grant Megan absolute total authority over Tommy's healthcare and psychiatric treatments without ever needing my secondary approval or oversight. Terrence smiled, patting my hand with fake affection. He said it would make things so much easier for the family. He told me to just sign the paper and let Megan handle the heavy lifting. He said I should be enjoying my hard-earned retirement, not stressing over complicated medical charts and behavioral therapies. I looked down at the crisp legal document resting on the table. The printed words seemed to burn under the dim lights of the lounge. It was essentially a blank check for murder. My own son was sitting right across from me, actively facilitating the permanent destruction of his own child, just to secure a massive financial payout. He was trading his little boy's brain for luxury cars, tailored suits, and the approval of a wicked, greedy woman. I picked up the silver pen, feeling its cold metallic weight between my calloused fingers. I stared at the signature line where I was supposed to sign away my grandson's safety. I did not sign the paper. I slowly put the pen down on the table, placing it deliberately parallel to the fraudulent document. I raised my head and stared directly into my son's eyes. The father-son bond, the decades of unconditional love and fierce protection I had poured into this man officially died in my mind at that exact second. I was no longer looking at my child. I was looking at a parasite. The next morning I knew I had to act fast. The poison was already taking a toll on my grandson, and I could not let him ingest another drop while I finalized my counterattack. I waited until Sylvia was in the shower and Megan was busy upstairs. I pulled Tommy into my basement office and locked the heavy door. The boy looked up at me with tired, confused eyes. I kneeled down and handed him a thick, dark gray cotton handkerchief. I told him we were going to play a secret agent game and he had to follow my instructions exactly. I explained that the juice Grandma gave him was not making him strong. I said it was the reason he felt so sleepy and sick all the time. I told him he could never drink it again, but he also could never let them know he was not drinking it. I poured a small amount of water into a cup to practice. I showed Tommy how to take a sip, hold the liquid in the back of his cheeks, and puff his throat to mimic a swallowing motion. Then I showed him how to bring the handkerchief up to his mouth, pretending to wipe his lips while quietly spitting the liquid into the thick fabric. We practiced 5 times until he could do it flawlessly without spilling a single drop. I told him to keep the handkerchief stuffed deep in his front pocket at all times. I looked into his eyes and made him promise not to tell his parents or his grandmother about our secret mission. He nodded solemnly, trusting me completely. By dinner time, the atmosphere in the dining room was thick with unspoken tension. Sylvia had prepared a large roast chicken with heavy sides of mashed potatoes and gravy. Terrence was scrolling through his phone, completely ignoring his family. Megan sat directly across from Tommy, cutting her food with sharp, aggressive movements. The problem was immediately obvious to anyone paying attention. Tommy was sitting up perfectly straight. The heavy fog that usually clouded his eyes was completely gone. He was actually eating his food with a genuine appetite, eagerly asking me questions about the baseball game playing on the television in the background. The secret training had worked perfectly that morning, but it had also inadvertently exposed a massive flaw in their timeline. Megan stopped chewing her food. She stared intently at Tommy, her eyes narrowing into cold, calculating slits. She watched how steady his hands were as he held his fork. She glanced over at Sylvia, who was nervously avoiding her gaze, staring intensely at her own plate. Megan placed her silverware down and asked Sylvia in a sharp, interrogating tone if Tommy had finished his morning juice. Sylvia stammered quickly, nodding her head and insisting she watched him drink every last drop before school. Megan did not believe a single word coming out of her mother-in-law's mouth. She knew the chemical strength of the drug she was illegally providing. A child with that massive amount of risperidone in his system should be practically comatose by sunset, not happily chatting about sports statistics. Megan stood up from her chair, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. She walked purposefully into the kitchen out of my direct line of sight and returned a moment later. In her right hand she held a small glass of water and one of those unmarked blue pills. She did not even bother to hide it or crush it into a powder this time. The sheer arrogance and desperation to secure the trust fund had made her entirely reckless. She walked right up behind Tommy's chair and placed the solid pill directly next to his dinner plate. She placed her hands firmly on his small shoulders, pinning him in place so he could not squirm away. She leaned down, her voice dripping with a venomous tone masked as maternal care. She told Tommy he looked a little pale today and said it was time to take his special evening vitamin to help him sleep. She ordered him to swallow it right now with the water and wait for her to check his mouth. Tommy froze completely. He looked across the table at me, pure terror flashing in his wide brown eyes. He knew he could not use the handkerchief trick with a solid pill while she was standing directly over him watching his throat. I had to intervene immediately. I could not let that heavy dose of poison enter his small body. My mind raced, calculating the fastest way to break her focus. I reached across the center of the table toward the large, heavy ceramic tureen filled with boiling hot chicken soup. It had just come off the stove, emitting thick clouds of violently hot steam. I gripped the sides of the heavy bowl, pulling it toward me with deliberate force. Terrence was sitting immediately to my right, still completely absorbed in his glowing phone screen, oblivious to the danger surrounding his own son. As I lifted the heavy ceramic off the table mat, I intentionally twisted my wrist, faking a sudden violent muscle spasm. I let out a loud, sharp grunt of fake pain and shoved the entire tureen sideways with all my upper body strength. The heavy bowl tipped over completely, dumping a massive wave of boiling hot soup, thick vegetables, and searing broth directly into Terrence's lap. The physical reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Terrence let out a deafening, high-pitched scream of sheer agony, jumping up from his chair so violently he knocked it over backward with a massive crash. He was desperately clawing at his scalding trousers, cursing loudly as the steaming hot liquid soaked right through the expensive fabric, burning his skin. Absolute chaos erupted in the dining room. Sylvia shrieked in terror, dropping her own plate on the floor. Megan instinctively let go of Tommy's shoulders, turning her attention entirely to her screaming husband. She rushed over, grabbing cloth napkins from the table and trying to frantically help him wipe the boiling broth off his legs. In that exact split second of total distraction, I kicked my heavy boot sharply under the table, hitting Tommy's shin to snap his attention. I gave him a fierce, commanding look, pointing with my eyes. The boy understood instantly. He snatched the blue pill off the table and shoved it deep into his pants pocket. I grabbed his glass of water and dumped it onto the spilled soup, adding to the chaotic mess on the floor, erasing any proof the pill was ever there. I stood up, apologizing profusely, rubbing my hands together, and loudly claiming my severe arthritis had caused my grip to completely fail. Terrence was absolutely furious, pacing around the room, red-faced and shouting about his burned legs and his ruined designer suit. Megan was furious too, glaring at me with pure, unadulterated hatred for causing the disruption, but her primary predatory focus had been successfully broken. The poison pill was gone. Tommy was safe for another night. The dinner was completely ruined. Terrence stormed upstairs to take a cold shower and assess his burns. I sent Tommy straight up to his bedroom, telling him to get ready for bed, while Sylvia and Megan stayed behind to clean up the disaster. I retreated to my study, watching the hidden camera feed to ensure they did not try anything else. I saw Megan gathering Tommy's laundry from the hallway basket. She aggressively checked the pockets of his denim jeans before tossing them into the washing machine. Her hand stopped moving. She pulled out the dark gray cotton handkerchief I had given him that morning. It was soaking wet and heavily stained with orange juice. She slowly brought the fabric up to her nose and inhaled. Her expression turned to absolute ice. She looked directly toward the ceiling, right where my room was located. She knew the boy had not swallowed the poison. She knew someone had taught him how to fake it. And she knew exactly who was responsible. I knew Megan would not wait long to retaliate. The discovery of that stained handkerchief meant the Cold War was over. She would escalate the dosage or try something far more drastic to secure her prize. I had to get Tommy out of that house immediately. At 4 a.m, the sky was still pitch black. I quietly walked into Tommy's room and gently shook his shoulder. I put a finger to my lips, signaling him to stay completely silent. I whispered that we were going on a surprise weekend fishing trip, just the two of us. The boy rubbed his eyes but smiled, a genuine spark of excitement cutting through the lingering chemical fog in his system. I grabbed his pre-packed duffel bag and guided him down the back stairs, avoiding the creaky floorboards. I left a hastily scribbled note on the kitchen island, claiming I decided to take advantage of the good weather for a spontaneous camping and fishing trip, and that we would be back late Sunday. By the time Sylvia and Megan woke up to execute whatever wicked plan they had cooked up overnight, Tommy and I were already 30 miles out of town, cruising down the interstate in my heavy-duty truck. I did not drive straight to our destination. A lifetime in the cutthroat construction business taught me to always check my blind spots. I took 3 different highway exits, doubled back through rural country roads, and parked behind a decaying diner for 20 minutes just to watch the traffic behind me. I had to be absolutely certain no one was tailing us. Not Megan's hired hands, not Sylvia's mafia debt collectors, and certainly not the police. Once I was completely confident the road was clear, I turned the truck onto a hidden gravel path completely obscured by towering pine trees. We drove for another 10 miles deep into the wooded outskirts of the county. We arrived at a secluded, highly fortified cabin. I bought this property 7 years ago under a blind corporate LLC entirely separate from my main construction firm. Sylvia did not know it existed. Terrence had never seen it. It was my personal sanctuary, a place built with reinforced steel doors, shatterproof windows, and an independent solar grid. Now it was going to serve as our fortress. I unlocked the heavy deadbolts and ushered Tommy inside. The cabin was fully stocked with non-perishable food, bottled water, and emergency supplies. I turned on the generator, and the warm lights flickered to life, illuminating the rustic wooden interior. Tommy dropped his duffel bag, looking around with wide eyes. He asked if this was where we were going to fish. I patted his head and told him the lake was just out back, but we had to wait for a special guest before we could cast our lines. I set him up on the leather sofa with a comic book and went into the kitchen to prepare a real hearty breakfast for the boy. No hidden powders, no crushed pills, just eggs, bacon, and clean, fresh juice. I watched him eat ravenously, realizing just how much they had been starving him of his basic vitality. He looked so small, so vulnerable sitting there. The rage I felt toward Terrence and Megan burned hotter than a furnace, but I kept my face totally serene. I had to remain the steady, unshakable grandfather he needed. An hour later, a nondescript gray sedan rolled up the gravel driveway. I stepped out onto the porch to greet Dr. Eris Thorne. He carried a heavy black medical case and wore a grim expression. I had called him on a secure line during the drive, explaining the escalating danger and asking for a massive favor. Without a second thought, he canceled his morning appointments and drove out to the safe house. Eris walked inside and offered Tommy a warm, friendly smile. He told the boy he was just here to do a quick superhero health check to make sure he was strong enough to catch a massive bass. Tommy bravely rolled up his sleeve. Eris was a professional, expertly drawing 3 vials of blood with a butterfly needle before handing the boy a bandage and a lollipop. I sent Tommy to the back porch to organize the fishing tackle. Eris and I stood in the kitchen. He pulled a portable rapid centrifuge and a digital chemical analyzer from his case. We waited in agonizing silence as the machine processed the blood samples. When the digital screen finally beeped, Eris reviewed the data. His face hardened. He looked at me and said, "The toxicity levels are incredibly alarming, Raymond. It is not just the cognitive suppression anymore. The physical damage is accelerating." He pointed to the digital readouts showing me elevated liver enzymes and severe stress markers on the kidneys. The massive daily doses of risperidone were forcing Tommy's small organs into overdrive, trying to filter out the heavy adult antipsychotic chemicals. Eris printed the results directly from his portable device, signing his name and stamping it with his official medical credential. He handed me the thick stack of papers. He told me this is irrefutable, court-admissible proof of systemic chemical poisoning. He said the boy is experiencing early-stage organ distress, and if they had continued this regimen for another few weeks, his liver would have completely failed. I held the medical report in my hands. The paper felt heavier than a brick. I now had the ultimate weapon. The medical evidence was complete, undeniable, and legally binding. I thanked Eris and securely locked the medical report inside my heavy iron safe. Just as Eris packed up his equipment to leave, the silence of the cabin was shattered by the harsh, relentless vibrating of my phone resting on the kitchen counter. The screen lit up with dozens of missed call notifications. My phone was blowing up. I picked it up and saw an incoming text message from Terrence. The preview banner showed his words clearly. The message read, "Where did you take the boy? We found the wet handkerchief in the laundry. You are completely insane. I am not playing games anymore, Dad. I just called the authorities. The police are on their way to arrest you for kidnapping." I stared at the glowing screen, my jaw locked tight. The final battle had officially arrived at my doorstep. The wail of the sirens pierced the absolute silence of the woods. It was not just one police cruiser, but several tearing up the gravel path leading to my secluded property. The heavy tires crunched against the stones, kicking up massive clouds of gray dust. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the dense pine trees, casting wild, chaotic shadows against the reinforced steel door of my cabin. I stood in the center of the living room looking out the reinforced window. Right behind the patrol cars, a sleek, white luxury vehicle slammed on its brakes. Terrence and Megan jumped out before the car even came to a complete halt. Megan was putting on the performance of a lifetime. She was sobbing hysterically, clutching her chest and pointing frantically at the cabin. She screamed to the officers that her baby was inside with a dangerous, unstable man. She played the role of the devastated, terrified mother, flawlessly, letting her knees buckle slightly so a young deputy had to support her weight. The officers drew their weapons, moving with aggressive, tactical precision. I turned to Tommy, who was sitting on the leather sofa, clutching his comic book with wide, terrified eyes. I kept my voice perfectly steady and told him not to be afraid. I explained that these policemen were just here to help us clear up a big misunderstanding. I instructed him to stay seated and not to move, no matter how loud things got. Just seconds later, heavy fists pounded against the front door. A voice boomed through a megaphone ordering me to step away from the child and open the door with my hands raised. I did not hesitate. I walked calmly to the entryway, unlatched the heavy deadbolts, and swung the door wide open. 3 police officers stormed into the cabin with their weapons drawn and leveled directly at my chest. They shouted overlapping commands, ordering me to get down on the ground and put my hands behind my back. I did not kneel, but I slowly raised my hands, interlacing my fingers behind my head, to show I was not a physical threat. A heavy-set officer lunged forward, grabbing my right arm with brutal force and twisting it behind my back. He shoved me roughly against the wooden wall of the entryway, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. He aggressively told me I was under arrest for the kidnapping and unlawful detainment of a minor. Megan stood just outside the threshold, crying loudly and shouting that I was a monster who had stolen her precious child in the middle of the night. Terrence stood right beside her, trying to look intimidating but failing completely. I did not struggle against the officer's grip. The cold steel of the handcuff clamped down harshly on my right wrist. I kept my breathing even and my voice absolutely authoritative. I told the lead officer that he was making a massive jurisdictional mistake. I stated clearly that it is legally impossible for a man to kidnap a child over whom he holds full active legal guardianship. The lead officer signaled the man holding me to pause. He frowned, looking at me with intense suspicion, and asked what I was talking about. I told him to reach into the inner left breast pocket of my jacket. I explained that he would find a notarized legal document folded inside. The officer hesitated but patted down my jacket. He reached inside and pulled out a thick piece of parchment paper bearing the official seal of the state family court. I watched Megan's fake tears stop for a fraction of a second as confusion washed over her face. I explained the context in a loud, clear voice so everyone, including my treacherous son and daughter-in-law, could hear every single word. I stated that exactly 14 months ago, Terrence and Megan desperately wanted to enroll Tommy in an elite private academy across town. The tuition was exorbitantly expensive, far beyond what their reckless spending habits could afford. They came begging to me for the money. The academy had a strict administrative policy requiring the primary financial benefactor to possess legal, educational, and medical guardianship to process the massive direct payments and sign the enrollment waivers. Terrence, being incredibly lazy and blinded by the prestige of the school, happily signed a temporary but comprehensive legal guardianship transfer. He handed over full medical and educational authority to me just to get his hands on my money. I looked directly at Terrence, whose jaw had dropped completely open in sudden, horrifying realization. I informed the police that the document was never revoked. It was signed, notarized, and legally binding. I had every legal right to take my grandson on a weekend fishing trip without notifying anyone. The lead officer read the document carefully, his eyes scanning the official stamps and the unmistakable signature of my son. The aggressive tension in the room instantly shifted. The officer holding my arm slowly unlatched the steel handcuff and took a step back. Megan realized her kidnapping narrative was rapidly falling apart. She pushed past the deputies and stepped into the cabin, dropping her crying act entirely. Her voice became shrill and demanding. She screamed that the document was just an educational formality and that I was still a dangerously unstable old man who had dragged a sick child into the woods. She demanded the police take Tommy away from me, immediately claiming the boy needed his highly specialized psychiatric medication. That was the exact moment I unleashed the ultimate weapon. I walked calmly over to the kitchen island and picked up the thick stack of papers Dr. Eris Thorne had printed just 20 minutes prior. I walked back and slammed the medical file onto the wooden table right in front of the lead police officer. I told the officer that the woman standing in the doorway was not trying to give the boy medicine. I stated with absolute ironclad certainty that she was systematically poisoning him. I pointed to the official laboratory letterhead. I explained that this was a court-admissible real-time toxicology report conducted by a licensed physician. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Tommy had massive lethal levels of an adult antipsychotic called risperidone pumping through his small veins. I showed the officer the elevated liver enzymes and the critical organ distress markers highlighted in bright red ink. I stated that the boy was not autistic and he was not mentally impaired. He was being chemically lobotomized by his own mother to trigger a lucrative medical contingency clause in a $5 million trust fund. The lead officer read the medical readouts. The color drained from his face. He recognized the severity of the chemical agents listed on the official document. The officers completely released me, stepping away from my side. They slowly turned around, their hands dropping to rest heavily on their utility belts. They stared directly at Megan. The atmosphere in the cabin flipped completely. Megan was no longer the victim. She was the prime suspect of a horrific felony. Her shrill voice died in her throat. The fake tears dried up instantly, leaving her face pale and entirely devoid of color. She looked at the police officers advancing slowly toward her and realized the trap she had blindly walked into. She took a frantic, panicked step backward, stumbling over the wooden doorframe. She looked at Terrence, but my son was completely frozen in shock, staring at the toxicology report on the table. Megan reached into her designer purse with violently trembling hands. She pulled out her cell phone and immediately dialed the number of her shady puppet lawyer. She knew the police were about to ask questions she could not answer without incriminating herself. The physical confrontation was over, but the brutal legal war had just begun. After the police escorted them off my property, demanding Megan answer formal questions at the precinct with her lawyer, the crumbling of their unholy alliance happened faster than I ever anticipated. I sat at my sturdy wooden desk inside the safe house, ensuring Tommy was happily eating a fresh sandwich before I opened my laptop to check the live feeds from my home. The cameras Dexter had installed were functioning flawlessly. Terrence and Megan had just burst through the front door of my house. The pristine entranceway was instantly transformed into a battlefield. Terrence was pacing furiously, his expensive shoes hitting the hardwood with heavy, panicked steps. He was yelling, his voice cracking under the immense pressure. He demanded to know how I possessed an official toxicology report. He shouted that Megan had assured him the drug would never show up as a targeted antipsychotic on a standard blood panel without a specific subpoena. He called her reckless and stupid. Megan threw her designer purse against the wall, shattering a crystal vase I had bought for Sylvia decades ago. She screamed right back, her face flushed red with unhinged fury. She yelled that it was not her fault his supposedly senile father had suddenly turned into a master tactician. The illusion of their sophisticated, high-class partnership was completely gone, replaced by the frantic, desperate energy of cornered rats. Terrence pointed a trembling finger at his wife, telling her she had dragged him into a direct felony charge. He said the police were going to tear their lives apart and audit every single financial document they possessed. He was absolutely terrified, acting like a frightened child, realizing the devastating consequences of his own horrific actions. Megan did not back down. Instead, she stepped directly into his personal space. Her eyes were wide, filled with a terrifying, venomous superiority. Without a single second of hesitation, she raised her hand and slapped Terrence across the face with explosive force. The sharp crack echoed through the hidden microphones. Terrence stumbled backward, clutching his cheek, completely stunned by the sheer violence of the blow. Megan pointed her manicured finger directly at his face, her voice dropping into a cold, deadly hiss. She told him to shut his pathetic mouth. She said he was a weak, spineless coward who had never accomplished a single thing in his entire miserable life. And then the mask she had worn for years, the progressive, supportive white wife facade, completely fell away, exposing the vile, rotting racism underneath. She began hurling the most disgusting racial slurs imaginable at the man she married. She called him a worthless black parasite who only survived because he leeched off the hard work of his rich father. She said she was sick of pretending to respect him and sick of his mediocre, pathetic existence. She screamed that she only married him for his proximity to my wealth. She told him he was nothing but a stepping stone, a biological donor for a child she could use to extract my fortune. She said the only reason she endured his presence was the promise of a massive payout that would allow her to finally leave his miserable family behind. Hearing those vile, hateful words coming out of her mouth made my blood run entirely cold. I had always suspected Megan harbored a deep-seated arrogance, but witnessing her violently strip my son of his basic human dignity using his race as a weapon was a new level of pure evil. She stood there in my house, a house built with the blood and sweat of a proud black man shouting racist poison at my own flesh and blood. Terrence just stood there taking the horrific abuse. He did not defend himself, he did not defend his heritage, he did not defend his father. He simply stared at her, his spirit completely crushed by the woman he had chosen over his own family. He was a hollow, empty shell of a man paralyzed by his own monumental failures. He had sold his soul, his son, and his dignity for a woman who viewed him as less than human. I felt a profound, sickening disgust for the boy I had raised. The shouting match was so loud it drew Sylvia out of her bedroom. She hurried down the stairs, clutching the railing, her face pale and lined with severe anxiety. She stumbled into the living room, completely ignoring the violent tension between her son and his wife. Sylvia was entirely consumed by her own desperate situation. She grabbed Megan's arm, shaking it violently. She demanded her money right now. She screamed that the men in the black vehicles had returned this morning and threatened to burn the house down if she did not produce a massive payment by midnight. She told Megan the trust fund plan had clearly failed and demanded the $500,000 immediately to save her own life. Megan violently yanked her arm away from Sylvia's grasp. A sinister, mocking smile spread across Megan's face. She looked at her mother-in-law with absolute disgust. Megan reached into her blazer pocket, pulled out her cell phone, and tapped the screen. A clear audio recording started playing through the phone's speaker. It was Sylvia's own voice clearly stating that she had just crushed the extra pills into Tommy's morning juice and that the boy was heavily sedated. Sylvia gasped, her hands flying to cover her mouth in sheer horror. Megan turned off the recording and laughed, a cold, metallic sound. She told Sylvia that she had recorded every single conversation they ever had about poisoning the boy. Megan stepped closer to the terrified older woman, promising that if Sylvia demanded a single penny or uttered a word to the police, she would hand the audio files directly to the district attorney. Megan smiled wickedly, telling Sylvia she would rot in a federal prison cell for the rest of her miserable life. The alliance of monsters had officially collapsed. They were trapped in a cage of their own making, tearing each other apart for survival. I sat back in my chair watching the three of them turn against one another in my living room. They were doing the heavy lifting of destroying their own lives for me. It was poetic justice, but my satisfaction was abruptly cut short. My personal cell phone rang sharply, breaking the silence of the cabin. It was Dexter Cole calling on his secure, encrypted line. I answered the phone, keeping my eyes fixed on the camera feeds. Dexter's voice was urgent, stripped of his usual calm demeanor. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He said, "Mr. Raymond, we have a massive problem and it goes way beyond the trust fund. I just intercepted a series of highly sensitive financial transfers and banking authorizations from your primary holding accounts." He paused, taking a sharp breath. "They are not just targeting the $5 million anymore. You need to lock down the cabin and meet your lawyer, Richard Kaplan, immediately." I left Tommy safely guarded at the cabin with a highly trained security associate Dexter had arranged. The drive back into the heart of the city was a blur of highway lines and a dark brewing storm in my mind. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, menacing shadows across the urban skyline. I walked into the downtown high-rise housing the prestigious law firm of Richard Kaplan. Richard was a legal shark, a man whose courtroom ruthlessness was legendary in the city. He did not lose, and he did not tolerate fools. He was the kind of attorney who could dismantle a corporate conglomerate before his morning coffee. The atmosphere in his sprawling corner office was as tight as a piano wire. Dexter was already there, standing silently by the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, looking down at the heavy city traffic with his arms crossed. Richard sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his face completely devoid of its usual arrogant, confident smirk. He had a thick, leather-bound folder resting squarely under his folded hands. He did not offer me a drink or ask how my drive was. He simply pointed to the heavy leather chair across from him. I sat down, feeling the immense weight of the impending disaster settling over the room. The silence was heavy and deeply oppressive. Richard leaned forward, his sharp, predatory eyes locking directly onto mine. He took a slow breath and told me that in his 30 years of practicing corporate law, he had rarely seen a financial betrayal executed with such aggressive audacity. He slid the heavy folder across the polished wood toward me. He told me to open it and brace myself. I opened the folder. Inside were dozens of banking authorizations, commercial property deeds, and high-interest loan applications. My eyes immediately fell to the bottom of the first page. There was my signature. The sharp loops and harsh angles of my handwriting were perfectly replicated down to the exact pressure of the pen strokes. But I had never seen this document in my life. I looked up at Richard, demanding an immediate explanation. He told me that Megan had not just been plotting to steal Tommy's $5 million trust fund. The trust fund was her original long-term plan, but the massive gambling debt Sylvia owed to the syndicate had clearly forced Megan to accelerate her greed to catastrophic new levels. Megan had dug deep into the corporate structure of my legacy. 40 years ago, I started my construction empire with a single beat-up pickup truck and a heavy box of rusty tools. I built that company with my own calloused hands, pouring every ounce of my blood and sweat into the foundation of this city. I endured decades of systemic prejudice, fighting twice as hard as any white contractor just to secure my bids. Even though I retired and handed over the daily operations to my board of directors, I retained absolute majority ownership of the physical assets, the heavy machinery, the prime real estate, and the massive commercial warehouses. My company was entirely debt-free, an absolute fortress of financial stability. Richard tapped a manicured finger against the forged signature on the paper. He explained that Megan had somehow acquired my private corporate seals from my home office and replicated my signature flawlessly. She used her position as my daughter-in-law and Terrence's status as my only son to completely bypass the standard security checks at a predatory private lending firm. She essentially put up the entire physical infrastructure of my life's work as collateral. She took out a massive high-interest corporate loan for $3 million in cash. She leveraged the very company that fed and clothed her husband his entire life just to secure a mountain of instant, untraceable money. I stared at the paperwork, the sheer magnitude of the theft washing over me. $3 million. It was not just a robbery, it was an absolute desecration of my legacy. She was willing to let a ruthless bank seize my warehouses, sell off my heavy machinery, and destroy the livelihoods of hundreds of loyal employees just to line her own pockets. Richard explained that the private lending firm specialized in rapid corporate liquidity. They did not ask the necessary questions because the collateral was so incredibly valuable. If the loan defaulted, the firm would happily seize the $30 million company for a fraction of its true worth. Megan had effectively handed them the keys to my entire kingdom without batting an eye. She truly believed that as a white woman she was inherently entitled to the empire built by a black man she secretly despised. She thought I was just a foolish old man who would never notice the corporate sabotage until it was far too late. Dexter finally spoke, stepping away from the floor-to-ceiling window. He walked over and dropped a separate stack of papers onto the mahogany desk. He told me the $3 million was just the funding for their ultimate escape. He had tracked their recent digital footprint and flagged highly suspicious airline purchases made just a few hours ago. Megan and Terrence had purchased 2 first-class, one-way tickets to Geneva, Switzerland. They were scheduled to depart in exactly 48 hours. They were not just planning to steal my company and destroy my grandson's mind. They were planning to completely vanish across the globe. Dexter carefully laid out their timeline for me. The fraudulent $3 million loan was currently in the final stages of the banking underwriting process. The massive sum of money was scheduled to be directly wired into a secure offshore holding account Megan had recently established. That wire transfer was set to execute in exactly 48 hours. The moment the funds cleared the international banking protocols, they would board that flight to Europe and disappear forever. They were leaving Sylvia behind to face the deadly wrath of the local mafia alone. They were leaving me to deal with the complete collapse of my construction empire. And they were leaving Tommy to rot with a chemically altered brain. They had timed the entire operation perfectly. By the time the lending firm realized the loan was fraudulent, or by the time I realized the company was heavily mortgaged, they would be entirely untouchable. They would be living like royalty on another continent, financed entirely by my stolen wealth. I felt a dark, heavy rage simmering in my gut. They had meticulously calculated every single detail to ensure their own luxurious survival while burning down the lives of everyone around them. They thought they had outsmarted the entire system. They thought they had completely won the game. Richard grabbed his heavy desk phone, his fingers hovering anxiously over the keypad. He looked at me with strict professional urgency. He told me he needed my immediate verbal authorization to contact the federal banking authorities and freeze the loan disbursement. He said if we shut the transaction down right now, we could stop the $3 million from ever leaving the private lending firm and prevent the total loss of the corporate assets. I looked at the panicked expressions on both of their faces. I slowly reached into the inner pocket of my tailored jacket and pulled out a thick Dominican cigar. I clipped the end with deliberate precision and struck a match, watching the small flame dance for a brief second before taking a slow, deep drag. A thick cloud of fragrant smoke filled the sterile office. A cold, ruthless smile spread across my face. I looked directly at my lawyer and told him to put the phone down. I said, there is no need to block the loan, Richard. Let the money clear. Let them pack their designer bags. Let them think they have completely won. I left Richard's office and returned to the safe house where Tommy was fast asleep. I sat at the small kitchen table staring at my phone. It was time to cast the final line and reel these monsters in. I dialed Terrence's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice sharp and defensive, still expecting a massive legal fight after the disaster with the police at the cabin. I did not yell. I did not threaten him. I let out a long, trembling sigh, letting my voice crack perfectly. I channeled every ounce of exhaustion I had felt over the last few days and poured it into my performance. I told him I was completely done fighting. I said the brutal confrontation with the authorities had broken my spirit, and I was just too old to keep waging this war against my own flesh and blood. I told him he and Megan were right all along. I admitted that Tommy needed highly specialized psychiatric care that I simply could not provide. I said I was tired of standing in the way of my grandson's health. I told him I had spoken to my lawyer and I was ready to surrender full control of the $5 million trust fund to him and Megan immediately. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. Terrence was completely stunned. He asked if I was serious, his voice trembling with barely contained excitement. I told him I just wanted this nightmare to be over. I instructed him to bring Megan and his mother to Richard Kaplan's downtown office at 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon to sign the final transfer documents. I hung up the phone before he could say another word. The bait was officially in the water. I opened my laptop and pulled up the hidden camera feeds inside my house. I needed to see their exact reaction to my supposed surrender. The living room feed flickered to life. Terrence was standing in the center of the room, holding his phone, looking like he had just won the lottery. He shouted the news to Megan and Sylvia. The reaction was instantaneous and utterly sickening. Megan let out a loud, triumphant scream. She ran to the kitchen and returned with a bottle of expensive vintage champagne I had been saving for a special occasion. She popped the cork, the loud bang echoing through the audio feed as the sparkling wine spilled over the expensive hardwood floor. They did not care. They were celebrating their absolute victory. Megan poured 3 large glasses, handing one to her husband and one to Sylvia. She raised her glass high and toasted to the foolishness of old men. She laughed a cruel, wicked sound, boasting about how easily she had broken my spirit. Terrence puffed out his chest, acting like a strategic genius, claiming he knew I would eventually cave under the severe legal pressure. Sylvia drank her champagne greedily, her hands shaking with profound relief. She reminded Megan about their deal, demanding her $500,000 cut the second the ink was dry on the trust transfer. Megan smiled, her eyes flashing with pure deceit. She promised Sylvia she would wire the funds by tomorrow evening. I knew exactly what Megan was actually thinking. She had absolutely no intention of paying Sylvia a single dime. Megan and Terrence had those one-way tickets to Geneva ready. They were going to take the $5 million from the trust, combine it with the $3 million from the fraudulent corporate loan, and vanish, leaving Sylvia to face the ruthless syndicate alone. Watching them drink my champagne and celebrate the successful destruction of my family made my stomach churn. Their sheer arrogance was intoxicating them, blinding them to the reality of their situation. They thought they had outsmarted a man who built an empire from dirt. They thought they had secured a lifetime of luxury. They had no idea they were celebrating their own funeral. The next afternoon, at exactly 3 o'clock, the heavy glass doors of Richard Kaplan's corner office swung open. I was already seated at the massive mahogany conference table wearing my sharpest tailored suit. Richard sat beside me, his face a stone-cold mask of legal authority. Terrence, Megan, and Sylvia walked into the room. They had dressed for a coronation. Terrence wore a brand-new designer suit that cost more than most people made in a month. Megan strutted in wearing a pristine white dress and a smug, condescending smirk that made my blood boil. Sylvia followed closely behind, clutching her expensive handbag, looking anxious but relieved. They walked into the lion's den with absolute confidence. They did not see the danger. They only saw the $8 million floating just out of reach. Terrence offered a fake, sympathetic smile, pulling out a chair for his wife. He told me I was making the right decision. Megan sat down, crossing her legs elegantly and placing her designer purse on the table. She looked at Richard and demanded we skip the pleasantries and get straight to the signature pages. She said they had a very tight schedule to keep today. I knew she was referring to their international flight to Switzerland. Sylvia took a seat at the far end of the table, her eyes darting nervously between me and the legal documents resting in front of Richard. The sheer greed radiating from the three of them was palpable. They thought they had reached the finish line. They thought they had conquered the old man. I did not say a word. I simply looked at the 3 traders sitting across from me. They were completely relaxed, waiting for me to hand over the keys to my kingdom. Richard calmly closed the thick leather folder in front of him and folded his hands. He did not pull out a single pen. He did not slide any documents across the polished wood. Megan frowned, her smug smile faltering slightly as the heavy silence stretched on for a few agonizing seconds. She opened her mouth to complain about the delay. Before she could utter a single syllable, a sharp, heavy metallic click echoed loudly through the sterile office. Terrence turned his head in confusion. Dexter Cole had just stepped out into the hallway and engaged the heavy deadbolt on the exterior. The heavy mahogany door was firmly locked from the outside. There was no way out. The sharp metallic click of the deadbolt echoing through the room caused a brief ripple of confusion. Terrence glanced over his shoulder at the heavy mahogany door, but Megan was entirely too consumed by her own greed to care. She reached into her pristine white designer purse and pulled out a sleek silver fountain pen. She slid it aggressively across the polished wood of the conference table until it rested right in front of my hands. She tapped her manicured fingernail against the blank signature line on the top document. She told me to stop stalling and just sign the papers so everyone could finally move on with their lives. She said Tommy was waiting for his specialized care and every minute I wasted was hurting him. I looked down at the silver pen. I did not reach for it. I did not move a single muscle toward the legal documents. Instead, I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a small black remote control. I held her arrogant gaze for a long, silent second before I pressed the power button. The massive 80-inch flat-screen television mounted on the far wall behind Richard's desk hummed to life. The sudden, bright glare of the monitor illuminated the dark corners of the office. Megan frowned, crossing her arms tightly across her chest. She asked what kind of stalling tactic this was demanding Richard control his client. Richard simply leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms, mirroring her stance but with absolute predatory calm. I told Megan that before I signed away $5 million, I wanted to share a brief presentation about exactly what kind of specialized care she had been providing to my grandson. I pressed a button on the remote, and the first video file began to play in crystal clear high definition. The hidden camera embedded in the kitchen sugar bowl showed my spotless granite countertops. Megan gasped, taking a sudden sharp breath as she recognized herself on the massive screen. The video showed her pulling the small plastic bag of blue, unmarked pills from her blazer pocket. The audio was flawless, capturing the harsh grinding sound as she crushed the risperidone into a fine toxic powder using the porcelain mortar and pestle. The entire room watched in absolute silence as the giant screen showed her sweeping the crushed antipsychotic medication directly into Tommy's glass of morning orange juice. I switched to the next file. It was the audio recording from the afternoon they thought they were alone in the house. Megan's voice boomed from the surround sound speakers complaining that Tommy was still too alert. The speakers blasted her exact words demanding Sylvia double the dose of the medication because they needed him completely docile and severely impaired for the upcoming medical evaluation. The recording captured Megan clearly stating that the drug does not stop hearts, it just stops thoughts. Next, I played the video of Sylvia. The screen showed my wife standing nervously by the stove, intentionally acting as a lookout while her daughter-in-law poisoned her own grandson. The speakers echoed Sylvia's voice, agreeing to the horrific plan, admitting she was afraid of the school nurse, but willing to push the dosage to secure the payout. Before they could even attempt to process the shock of seeing their most sinister crimes broadcasted in high definition, I switched the presentation to a series of stark financial documents. The screen flashed massive spreadsheets highlighting the underground gambling dens and the illegal syndicate ledgers Dexter had uncovered. I zoomed in on the staggering $200,000 debt listed directly next to Sylvia's name. I displayed the text messages between Megan and Sylvia proving their sickening contract. The text on the screen showed Megan's explicit promise to wire Sylvia $500,000 from the trust fund in exchange for physically administering the poison. I let the evidence cycle, revealing the $50,000 Sylvia had stolen from my corporate black card to pay the mafia. I laid out every single piece of their wicked puzzle for them to see. There was no room for denial. There was no plausible deniability. I had documented their entire conspiracy, from the financial desperation to the attempted chemical lobotomy of a 10-year-old boy. I hit pause, leaving a massive frozen image of Megan dropping the powdered drugs into Tommy's glass, burning brightly on the screen. The silence in the conference room was no longer just heavy, it was absolutely suffocating. The sheer gravity of the exposed evidence hit the three of them like a freight train. All the arrogance, all the smug superiority completely evaporated from the room. Megan's face turned the color of chalk. Her jaw hung open, her breathing shallow and erratic. She stared at the frozen image of herself on the screen, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. She tried to speak, to formulate some kind of defense or legal threat, but her voice completely failed her. Only a pathetic squeak escaped her throat. She slowly backed away from the table, her legs visibly trembling under her pristine white dress. Terrence looked like a man who had just been struck by lightning. His entire body was shaking violently. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his hands gripped the edge of the mahogany table so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. He looked at the screen, then at Megan, then at his mother, realizing that the police at the cabin were just the beginning. He realized the absolute magnitude of the felony charges hanging over his head. He was trapped in a locked room with irrefutable proof of a monstrous conspiracy. Sylvia did not even try to stand. Her knees buckled beneath her and she collapsed onto the expensive carpet. She buried her face in her hands, letting out a loud, agonizing wail. She knew her life was completely over. She knew the mafia was coming for her, and she knew she had sacrificed her family for absolutely nothing. They were completely broken, stripped of their lives, and left utterly defenseless. But my vengeance was not fully complete. I had dismantled their financial plans and exposed their criminal conspiracy, but the deepest betrayal still needed to be addressed. I looked at Terrence, who was shivering like a frightened child, waiting for the ground to swallow him whole. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. My voice was calm, cold, and devoid of any paternal warmth. I told Terrence to look at the screen. I said I had shown them the trust fund conspiracy, but I was not finished yet. I pointed the black remote at the television one last time. I stared dead into my son's panicked eyes and told him, "The next video file is a very special gift just for you." I pressed the button on the black remote. The massive 80-inch screen flickered to a new piece of hidden camera footage. It was the feed from my own living room captured right after their humiliating defeat at the safe house. The high-definition video showed Megan and Terrence screaming at each other, but this time it played out entirely differently than Terrence remembered. On the screen, Megan delivered the vicious slap across his face. The sharp crack echoed through the silent law office. Then came the vile, racist venom. The surround sound speakers blasted her voice as she called her husband a worthless parasite, using words so disgusting they made the air in the room feel completely toxic. Terrence sat frozen in his chair, watching his wife strip away his humanity in crystal-clear resolution. But the presentation did not stop there. The screen cut to a new audio clip recorded later that same evening. Terrence was out of the house and Megan was pacing the living room, holding her cell phone to her ear. The audio feed picked up her side of the conversation perfectly. She was talking to the fake behavioral psychologist, the man who had conducted the fraudulent evaluation on Tommy. Megan was laughing a cruel, mocking sound. She told the fake doctor that her spineless husband had absolutely no idea about their real plan. She said they were going to let the $3 million corporate loan clear, combine it with the $5 million trust fund, and board that flight to Geneva together. She called the fake doctor her true love and promised they would leave Terrence holding the bag for the entire massive financial fraud. She stated explicitly that Terrence was too stupid to realize he was being set up as the perfect fall guy for the federal authorities. She said, "Let the foolish black man rot in a federal prison while we sip wine in the Swiss Alps." The recording laid bare her ultimate betrayal. She never intended to take Terrence anywhere. He was nothing but a disposable pawn in her grand scheme. The silence that followed the end of the video was shattered by a sound I had never heard come from my son before. It was a deep, guttural roar of pure animalistic agony. Terrence completely snapped. The sheer weight of the absolute humiliation, the horrifying realization that his entire marriage was a meticulously crafted trap designed to destroy him, broke his mind into 1,000 jagged pieces. He turned his head slowly to look at Megan. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and entirely bloodshot. Megan tried to scramble backward, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor, but she was trapped between the heavy mahogany table and the wall. She raised her hands frantically, trying to formulate an excuse, stammering that the audio was manipulated or taken out of context. Terrence did not listen to a single word. He lunged across the massive conference table like a wild beast. He completely ignored the legal documents, scattering them into the air like worthless confetti. He tackled Megan with terrifying force, sending her heavy leather chair crashing backward onto the floor. The pristine corporate environment instantly devolved into a brutal, chaotic battlefield. Terrence pinned Megan to the expensive carpet, his large hands wrapping directly around her throat. He was screaming in a blind rage, cursing her for destroying his life, for poisoning his son, and for using him as a disposable shield. Megan gasped for air, her face rapidly turning a deep shade of purple. She clawed frantically at his arms, her manicured acrylic nails digging deep into his skin, drawing sharp lines of blood down his wrists. She kicked her legs wildly, knocking over a side table and shattering a crystal water pitcher against the floor. Sylvia, who was already weeping on the ground, let out a blood-curdling shriek. She tried to crawl toward them, grabbing weakly at Terrence's jacket, begging him to stop before he committed murder right there in the office. Terrence violently shoved his mother away with one arm, sending her tumbling back into the corner of the room. He turned his attention back to Megan, his grip tightening with lethal intent. Megan thrashed like a trapped animal, choking and sputtering, her pristine white designer dress now torn and stained with her husband's blood. It was an absolutely pathetic display of two monsters turning their fangs on each other, tearing themselves apart when the illusion of their superiority was finally stripped away. Through the entire violent spectacle, Richard Kaplan did not flinch. He did not shout for order or attempt to pull the enraged man off his choking wife. The seasoned corporate lawyer simply sat back in his plush leather chair, resting his elbows on the armrests and steepling his fingers together. He watched the vicious brawl unfolding on his office floor, with the detached, cold, analytical gaze of a man watching a predictable science experiment conclude. I remained perfectly still beside him, my face an absolute mask of stone. I felt absolutely no instinct to protect my son. The man actively strangling his treacherous wife on the floor was a stranger to me, a pathetic parasite who had willingly allowed my grandson to be chemically lobotomized. I felt nothing but a cold, hollow satisfaction watching the ultimate consequence of their unchecked greed consume them entirely. Richard calmly reached his right hand under the thick edge of his mahogany desk. He located a small, concealed panic button integrated directly into the wood and pressed it firmly. He then checked the heavy gold watch strapped to his wrist, casually noting the time as if he were waiting for a scheduled delivery. He looked over at me and offered a brief, sharp nod of confirmation. We did not need to speak. The trap had been flawlessly executed and the final phase was entirely out of our hands. Megan was beginning to lose consciousness, her thrashing movements growing significantly weaker as Terrence's manic grip restricted her oxygen. Sylvia was hyperventilating in the corner, completely paralyzed by the sheer terror of the violence surrounding her. The room was filled with the sickening sounds of choking, breaking glass, and frantic scuffling. Then a sharp, heavy click echoed from the main entrance. The heavy deadbolt Dexter had engaged from the outside was suddenly unlocked. The heavy mahogany doors of the conference room burst open with explosive, terrifying force. 4 heavily armed federal agents wearing dark tactical vests emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the FBI stormed into the room. Right behind them were 2 plainclothes undercover police officers, their badges shining brightly against their belts. They did not shout warnings or ask for compliance. They moved with absolute, overwhelming physical authority. 2 massive agents instantly tackled Terrence, ripping him off Megan and slamming his face forcefully into the carpet. They pinned his arms behind his back, the sharp metallic clicking of heavy steel handcuffs echoing loudly through the room. Another agent hauled a gasping, coughing Megan off the floor, roughly twisting her arms behind her ruined white dress and locking her into gleaming handcuffs. The net had officially closed. The lead FBI agent, a towering man with a squared jaw and absolutely no patience for corporate criminals, stepped directly over the shattered crystal on the floor. He looked down at Megan, who was still coughing violently and gasping for air on the expensive carpet. He did not offer her a hand up. Instead, he pulled a laminated card from his tactical vest and began reading her rights with a voice as cold and hard as concrete. He informed her that she was being placed under immediate federal arrest. He rattled off the charges, and each one fell like a heavy hammer blow in the silent room. He stated she was being indicted for massive federal wire fraud conspiracy to commit bank fraud and aggravated identity theft stemming from the forged commercial loan documents. He made it crystal clear that the federal government was fully aware of the $3 million loan she had attempted to steal using my company as collateral. He did not stop there. One of the plainclothes state detectives stepped forward, his badge gleaming under the bright office lights, and added to the crushing list of felonies. The detective looked at her with pure disgust and informed her she was also being charged with severe child endangerment, the illegal administration of a controlled substance, and conspiracy to commit grievous bodily harm against a minor. The sheer weight and magnitude of the charges were staggering. They were not just taking her away for a white-collar financial crime where she could post a massive cash bail and fight the charges from the comfort of a luxury mansion. They were hitting her with a devastating combination of federal and state indictments that guaranteed she would not see the outside of a maximum security prison cell for decades. Megan lay on the floor, her chest heaving as the reality of her total destruction washed over her. The arrogant mastermind who had plotted to steal an $8 million fortune chemical, lobotomize a 10-year-old boy, and flee to the Swiss Alps was now staring at a lifetime of concrete walls and steel bars. Her grand master plan had completely collapsed into ashes. But Megan was not the type of woman to accept defeat with any shred of dignity or grace. As the initial shock wore off, the suffocating realization of her entrapment triggered a wild, unhinged desperation. She began to thrash violently against the grip of the federal agent holding her arms. She screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking and echoing harshly off the mahogany walls of the conference room. She demanded her right to remain silent, but completely ignored it in the exact same breath, spewing a chaotic torrent of threats and vile accusations. She screamed that this was an illegal setup, a total fabrication orchestrated by a senile old man and a corrupt lawyer. She glared at Richard Kaplan and threatened to sue his entire firm into bankruptcy, claiming she would have his law license permanently revoked for facilitating a false arrest. She shrieked that she knew powerful people, that she would drag the FBI through a massive civil rights lawsuit for police brutality and unlawful detainment. She even tried to play her final desperate card, demanding they let her go because she was a respectable white woman being unfairly targeted. The carefully constructed facade of the sophisticated upper-class corporate wife completely and utterly disintegrated right before my eyes. The elegant, poised daughter-in-law who had confidently sipped vintage champagne just 24 hours ago was replaced by a feral, shrieking animal. Her pristine white designer dress was torn at the shoulder and heavily stained with Terrence's blood from their vicious brawl. Her perfectly styled hair was a tangled, chaotic mess hanging wildly over her face. Thick black mascara ran down her cheeks, mixing with her sweat and tears. She looked absolutely pathetic, stripped of her false superiority and exposed to the world as the vile monster she truly was. The federal agents had absolutely zero tolerance for her hysterical performance. When she tried to kick backwards with her expensive high heels, the lead agent swiftly and forcefully drove his knee into the center of her back, pinning her flat against the carpet. The impact knocked the wind completely out of her lungs, silencing her frantic screaming in an instant. He tightened the heavy steel handcuffs around her wrists with a sharp, painful click, yanking her arms up just high enough to ensure total compliance. He leaned down and told her in a low, menacing tone that if she kicked one more time, he would add assaulting a federal officer to her rapidly growing list of felonies. Megan finally stopped thrashing. She lay pinned against the floor, her chest heaving heavily, her expensive heels scraping weakly against the carpet. The fight was completely beaten out of her. The agents hauled her roughly to her feet. She stumbled, her legs shaking violently, unable to support her own weight properly. She looked absolutely broken, entirely humiliated, and completely stripped of her power. As they turned her toward the heavy mahogany doors to march her out into the hallway, she locked eyes with me one final time. I expected to see a desperate plea for mercy, or perhaps a flare of unadulterated hatred. But what I saw in her eyes was pure, paralyzing terror. She was looking at the man she thought was a foolish, clueless old stepping stone and realizing too late that he was actually the architect of her absolute demise. I had built a $30 million empire in a world designed to keep men like me down. I had dealt with ruthless corporate predators, corrupt city officials, and cutthroat union bosses for 40 years. Megan truly believed she was the smartest predator in the room simply because of her race and her arrogant ambition. Now staring at me as a federal prisoner, she finally understood that she was completely outmatched from the very beginning. I did not glare at her. I did not show her any anger or triumphant rage. I sat back in my chair perfectly still and looked at her with absolute freezing indifference. I looked at her the exact same way a man looks at a disgusting cockroach right before he crushes it under the heavy heel of his work boot. She was a pest, a vile parasite that had infested my home and threatened my bloodline, and now she was being permanently exterminated. I did not say a single word to her. I did not need to. The silence radiating from me was a heavier punishment than any insult I could have thrown. It confirmed her total irrelevance. She was no longer a threat. She was nothing. Megan let out a broken, pathetic whimper as the agents forcefully shoved her out of the conference room and into the cold, sterile hallway, dragging her toward the elevators and her new terrifying reality. With Megan and Terrence dragged out of the room, the chaotic noise faded, leaving a sudden, heavy quiet in the office. Richard Kaplan adjusted his tie and calmly began gathering the scattered legal documents from the floor. In the far corner of the room, Sylvia was still cowering on the carpet. Thinking the storm had passed and the attention was entirely focused on the federal arrests, she slowly pressed her hands against the wall. She began to slide quietly toward the open doorway, hoping to slip away unnoticed into the city streets. I did not even turn my head. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead and let my voice ring out loud and cold across the room. "Where do you think you are going, Sylvia?" My voice echoed off the polished mahogany walls, stopping Sylvia dead in her tracks. She froze, her hand hovering just inches from the heavy brass door handle. Slowly she turned around. The sheer terror in her eyes was pathetic. The elegant older woman who spent her days at high-end country clubs and illegal underground casinos was completely gone. Her legs gave out. She dropped to the floor and began crawling across the expensive carpet toward my chair. She threw her arms around my legs, burying her tear-stained face into the fabric of my trousers. She sobbed loudly, a desperate, hysterical sound begging for mercy. She cried out my name, pleading with me to remember our 40 years of marriage. She reminded me of our early days when we had nothing but a rusty pickup truck and a dream. She claimed she was terrified of the syndicate and that Megan had aggressively manipulated her into a corner. She swore she loved Tommy and that she was a good wife who simply made a terrible, desperate mistake out of sheer panic. She squeezed my legs tighter, begging me to protect her like I always had, to wrap my arms around her and tell her we could fix this mess together. The sheer audacity of her using our 4 decades of marriage as a shield absolutely disgusted me. She was trying to weaponize the very history she had so easily betrayed. I did not reach down to comfort her. I did not place a reassuring hand on her shoulder. I looked down at the top of her perfectly styled hair with an expression of absolute freezing contempt. I forcefully kicked my legs back, breaking her desperate grip and causing her to stumble backward onto the floor. I stood up, towering over her trembling frame. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a thick stack of crisp legal documents Richard Kaplan had prepared for me earlier that morning. I threw them down. They landed heavily on the carpet right in front of her tear-stained face. I told her in a voice devoid of any warmth that the papers she was looking at were a unilateral divorce petition and an immediate emergency eviction notice signed by a judge. I informed her that she was legally stripped of all access to my homes, my properties, and my businesses effective immediately. I told her that 40 years of marriage meant absolutely nothing, the exact second she decided to feed antipsychotic poison to my 10-year-old grandson to cover her pathetic gambling debts. I demanded she open her designer purse immediately. Sylvia stared at the divorce papers, her entire body shaking as the reality of her total excommunication set in. She fumbled with the gold clasp of her handbag. I commanded her to hand over every single credit card, debit card, and access key tied to my accounts. With violently trembling hands, she pulled out the exclusive corporate black cards, the platinum bank cards, and the heavy brass keys to our estate. She dropped them onto the mahogany table. I looked at the pile of plastic and metal that had funded her secret double life. I told her that her access to my empire was permanently severed. I stated clearly that she came into my life 40 years ago with absolutely nothing, and that is exactly how she was leaving it. I told her she was no longer a wife, a mother, or a grandmother. She was just a desperate woman with a massive debt and zero protection. I turned to the 2 plain-clothes state detectives who were finishing up their paperwork near the door. I formally requested that they escort this trespassing individual off my legal premises. The detectives did not hesitate. They stepped forward and grabbed Sylvia by the arms, hauling her to her feet. She shrieked and fought, begging me not to throw her out into the street. She screamed that the men from the syndicate were going to kill her if she did not have the money. I walked past her and stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows, looking down at the bustling downtown street far below. I told her she should have thought about the consequences before she sold her grandson's brain to the highest bidder. The detectives dragged her out of the conference room, her agonizing wails echoing down the sterile corporate hallway until the heavy elevator doors finally snapped shut. I looked down through the thick glass at the street-level entrance of the high-rise building. Through the gathering dusk, I saw 2 heavily tinted matte black sport utility vehicles idling illegally in the loading zone directly outside the main lobby. Their hazard lights flashed in a slow, menacing rhythm. They were the exact same vehicles that had parked outside my home. The syndicate had clearly been tracking her movements, waiting for the supposed trust fund payout to clear. Down on the sidewalk, Terrence was being marched toward a federal transport van in heavy steel handcuffs. He stopped walking, his eyes locking onto the flashing lights of the black vehicles. He watched in absolute paralyzed horror as his mother was shoved out of the revolving glass doors of the lobby by the police, right into the waiting perimeter of the ruthless mobsters. The syndicate enforcers stepped out of their vehicles, instantly blocking her path of escape. Terrence stood there helpless, a prisoner in chains, forced to watch the men close in on his mother, knowing he could do absolutely nothing to save her. I walked out of the heavy revolving glass doors of the high-rise, stepping into the cool evening air. The street was bathed in the chaotic glow of flashing red and blue police lights. The federal transport van was parked at the curb, its heavy steel rear doors wide open. 2 federal agents were standing on either side of Terrence, preparing to load him into the back of the reinforced vehicle. When Terrence heard the heavy thud of my boots on the concrete, he violently whipped his head around. The sight of me standing there, completely untouched and entirely in control, shattered the final fragile pieces of his sanity. The arrogant entitlement, the tailored designer suits, the smug superiority, it all instantly evaporated. He was no longer a 38-year-old man. He regressed into a terrified, weeping child. He planted his feet against the pavement, refusing to move forward, and began to pull desperately against the grip of the federal agents. His face was a hideous mask of panic covered in sweat tears and the dried blood from his physical altercation with Megan. He looked at me with wide, desperate eyes and began to scream my name. He begged me to stop the agents, to tell them this was a massive misunderstanding. He cried out that Megan had manipulated him, that she had controlled his mind and forced him to go along with the horrific plan. He sobbed loudly, insisting he never actually wanted to hurt Tommy. He pleaded with me to use my wealth to save him. He begged me to hire Richard Kaplan to build a defense fund to post whatever astronomical bail the judge would set. He shouted that I could not let him rot in a federal prison. He strained his neck toward me, his voice cracking in sheer, pathetic desperation. He screamed that he was my only son. He cried out that he was my flesh and blood, the boy I had raised, the boy I had bought a baseball glove for all those years ago. He pleaded with me to remember that bond, to remember that he was my legacy. I signaled the lead federal agent with a slight raise of my hand, requesting a brief moment. The agent nodded, keeping a firm grip on Terrence's arm but allowing me to step within a few feet of my former son. I stood perfectly straight, my hands resting calmly in the pockets of my tailored coat. I looked at the pathetic, weeping creature in front of me and felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no paternal warmth, just a profound, echoing emptiness. I kept my voice low, steady, and entirely devoid of emotion. I told him to stop using the word family to shield his cowardice. I told him that being a father is not a biological accident. It is a sacred vow. It is a lifelong blood oath to protect your children from the horrors of this world at any cost. I reminded him that I spent 40 years breaking my back, dealing with cutthroat contractors, swallowing my pride in rooms full of men who hated my skin color, all so he would never have to know the feeling of a cold house or an empty stomach. I built a fortress of wealth to ensure he would grow into a strong, independent man. But instead of using that foundation to build his own life, he used it to become incredibly weak. I told him his privilege had turned him into a parasite. I did not raise my voice, but every single word cut through the cool night air like a razor blade. I told him that I did not build my empire so my legacy could be squandered by a coward who hides behind a wicked woman. I reminded him of the days I came home with bleeding hands and dust in my lungs just to pay for his elite private schools and his luxury cars. I gave him every single advantage in the universe, and he used those advantages to orchestrate the destruction of a purely innocent soul. I told him that his excuses about Megan's manipulation were an absolute insult to my intelligence. A manipulator only succeeds when they find a willing vessel. He was not a victim. He was a willing, eager accomplice to a monstrous crime. I told him to think about Tommy's face. I demanded he remember the way the boy looked at him with heavy, sedated eyes, trusting his father to protect him while his father actively handed the poison over. I said the ultimate measure of a man is what he does when the most vulnerable people in his life need a shield. Terrence chose to be the executioner instead of the shield. I told him that I would spend every remaining dime of my $30 million fortune ensuring he receives the maximum possible sentence in federal court. I promised him that I would sit in the front row of the courtroom and watch the judge lock him away until his hair turns gray and his bones turn to dust. I stated clearly that flesh and blood means absolutely nothing when the soul is completely rotten. I told him that a man who sells his child to the highest bidder forfeits his right to be called a father, and he forfeits his right to be called a son. I looked at him with absolute chilling finality. I told him he was nothing but a biological failure. I said, "You sold out your son, Terrence. You broke the most sacred law of nature. You are no longer my son. You are completely dead to me." The sheer absolute finality of my words struck Terrence harder than any physical blow ever could. The desperate, frantic hope that I would somehow swoop in and rescue him from his own catastrophic decisions completely vanished from his eyes. His legs simply stopped working. He collapsed entirely, his knees slamming violently against the hard concrete of the sidewalk. He hung his head, his chin resting against his chest, and let out a long, agonizing wail of total despair. It was the sound of a man realizing that he had destroyed every single good thing in his entire existence, and that there was absolutely no coming back from the abyss he had dug for himself. He had no money, no wife, no mother, no son, and now he officially had no father. He was utterly, entirely alone in the universe. The federal agents did not show a single ounce of sympathy. They grabbed him by the shoulders of his ruined designer suit, hauling his dead weight off the pavement with ruthless efficiency. They dragged him toward the open rear doors of the heavy transport van. Terrence did not fight them anymore. His spirit was entirely broken. He let his head loll to the side, his tears dripping onto the metal floorboard as they shoved him into the dark, cramped interior of the holding cell. The heavy steel doors slammed shut with a deafening metallic crash, sealing his fate behind reinforced bulletproof glass. The agent slapped the back of the van, signaling the driver. The heavy engine roared to life. I stood on the curb with my hands in my pockets, watching the red taillights of the transport vehicle disappear into the busy downtown traffic. I did not feel a single drop of remorse. A diseased, rotting limb had finally been amputated from my family tree. The infection was completely eradicated. 3 months passed with the slow, mechanical precision of a heavy grinding gear. The federal justice system moves with a cold, unyielding weight, and it completely crushed whatever fight was left inside the people who had tried to destroy my family. The trial took place in a massive, sterile federal courthouse located in the very center of the city. The room was a vast cavern of polished marble, heavy, dark mahogany wood, and absolute suffocating silence. It was entirely devoid of warmth, intentionally designed to make every defendant feel incredibly small against the overwhelming power of the law. I sat in the front row of the gallery wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, holding my posture completely rigid. Across the room, sitting at the defense tables, were the hollowed-out shells of the monsters who used to sit at my dining table. 3 months in a high-security county holding facility had entirely stripped away their polished upper-class veneer. Megan wore a standard-issue drab prison jumpsuit that hung loosely on her newly emaciated frame. Her blonde hair was dull, and her dark roots were showing, completely lacking the expensive salon treatments she used to demand. Terrence sat slightly apart from her, a physical representation of their completely shattered alliance. He stared blankly at the scarred wooden table in front of him, completely unresponsive to the bustling activity of the bailiffs and lawyers around him. He looked aged by decades, his shoulders slumped in a state of permanent defeat. The fake behavioral psychologist who had happily participated in the chemical abuse of my grandson sat nervously at a third table, sweating profusely and constantly wiping his forehead. The heavy wooden doors behind the bench swung open and the federal judge walked in. The entire room stood in absolute silence as the black-robed figure took his seat, presiding over the total ruin of their lives. The judge did not waste time with grand philosophical speeches. He looked down from his elevated bench, scanning the 3 defendants with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. The evidence we had provided, the high-definition video recordings, the irrefutable toxicology reports, and the meticulously forged corporate loan documents, was so overwhelmingly absolute that it forced all 3 of them into rapid guilty pleas just to avoid the maximum statutory penalties of a full jury trial. The judge addressed the fake psychologist first. He condemned the man for weaponizing a trusted medical profession to facilitate the severe abuse of a vulnerable child and the attempted theft of millions. The gavel slammed down with a sharp crack, delivering a brutal 10-year federal sentence for medical fraud, child endangerment, and criminal conspiracy. The man buried his face in his trembling hands, but the judge had already moved on to the next traitor. He turned his cold, heavy gaze toward Terrence. My former son slowly stood up, his legs trembling so violently he had to grip the edge of the table to remain upright. The judge spoke directly to him, dismantling whatever shred of dignity Terrence had left in his possession. He stated that while Terrence was not the primary architect of the financial fraud or the active poisoner, his role as a willfully blind accomplice was equally abhorrent to the court. He told Terrence that a father who stands by and allows his own son to be chemically lobotomized out of sheer cowardice and laziness is a uniquely pathetic creature who deserves no sympathy from the law. The judge sentenced Terrence to 7 years in a federal penitentiary for criminal negligence accessory to severe child endangerment and complicity in federal wire fraud. Terrence simply nodded his head slowly, completely broken, accepting his dark fate without a single word of protest. Finally, the judge turned his complete, undivided attention to Megan. She was forced to stand by the bailiff, her heavy metal chains rattling loudly in the quiet courtroom. The judge did not hold back a single ounce of his righteous fury. He outlined her crimes with surgical precision, describing her as a calculated, ruthless predator who viewed a child's developing brain as nothing more than a collateral stepping stone to secure a luxurious lifestyle. He noted the sheer audacity of her forging the signature of a highly successful businessman to illegally mortgage a $30 million company for her own selfish escape. He told her that her greed was a bottomless pit and that civil society needed to be permanently protected from her overwhelming malice. He looked her dead in the eyes and delivered the ultimate crushing blow. He sentenced Megan to 15 years in a maximum security federal prison. He deliberately added the most devastating legal caveat possible, specifically ruling that due to the severe, targeted nature of the child abuse and the massive scale of the federal financial crimes, she was entirely ineligible for early parole. She would serve every single second of those 15 years locked behind thick concrete walls. Through the entire grueling process of the sentencing, I sat in the front row completely motionless. I did not blink. I did not offer a satisfied smile. I did not shed a single tear for the destruction of my son or the long-term imprisonment of my daughter-in-law. I watched the heavy machinery of justice dismantle their entire existence with the cold, detached observation of a contractor watching a structurally unsound building being demolished to dust. When the judge finalized the absolute denial of her parole, Megan let out a sharp, breathless gasp. Her knees buckled and she slumped heavily against the defense table before the federal marshals yanked her aggressively back to her feet. As they began to shackle her wrists to a heavy waist chain, she turned her head and looked over her shoulder directly at me. Her eyes were completely bloodshot, filled with the profound, terrifying realization that her youth, her freedom, and her entire future were permanently erased. A few seconds later, Terrence turned his head as well. He looked at me with hollow, empty eyes resembling a lost ghost trapped inside a living body. They were both searching my face for a single fraction of an emotion, for pity, for anger, or for sorrow. They found absolutely nothing. My face was carved from solid granite. I stared back at them with chilling, absolute indifference. They were no longer human beings to me. They were just eradicated mistakes. The federal marshals tugged sharply on their heavy steel chains, barking harsh commands to move forward. Megan and Terrence were forced to turn around and march toward the heavy side doors of the courtroom. The heavy chains clinked rhythmically against the marble floor, providing a metallic soundtrack to their total demise. I watched the heavy wooden doors swing shut behind them, sealing them into the dark, suffocating labyrinth of the federal penal system. The toxic infection had finally been completely sterilized from my bloodline. The judge slammed his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block one final time, declaring the court officially adjourned. The sharp echo signaled the absolute end of the war. I stood up from the wooden gallery bench and slowly buttoned my tailored suit jacket. I did not look back at the empty defense tables. I turned my back on the sterile courtroom and walked deliberately down the long center aisle. I pushed open the heavy brass doors of the courthouse, stepping out of the dark, oppressive shadows and directly into the brilliant, warm sunlight. The sunlight felt like a cleansing fire, but I did not linger on the courthouse steps. I got into the waiting town car with Richard Kaplan and headed straight to the State Family Court building across town. The criminal trial had sent those monsters to a federal prison, but my most important legal battle was securing my grandson's permanent safety. Richard had already filed the extensive paperwork required for the involuntary termination of parental rights. Given the staggering weight of the federal convictions, the irrefutable medical evidence of severe chemical child abuse, and the explicit conspiracy to defraud the family trust, the family court judge did not hesitate for a single second. We sat in a small private chamber as the judge reviewed the final decrees. With a swift, decisive stroke of his pen, he permanently stripped Terrence and Megan of any and all legal, physical, and custodial claims to Tommy. They were legally erased from his life. They could never request visitation. They could never seek custody upon their eventual release, and they could never make a single medical or educational decision for him ever again. The judge handed me the heavily stamped document officially declaring me as Tommy's sole permanent legal guardian. I held the crisp paper in my hands, feeling an overwhelming sense of absolute relief. The boy was finally legally entirely mine to protect. The dark shadow his parents had cast over his young life was officially eradicated by the full power of the law. I thanked the judge and shook Richard's hand. The legal shield was now fully constructed, an impenetrable fortress around my grandson. With the legal war completely finished, I turned my entire focus to the most critical mission of all, which was repairing the physical and psychological damage inflicted upon my grandson. The detoxification process was not easy. Dr. Eris Thorne supervised every single step of Tommy's recovery, establishing a strict, carefully monitored medical regimen to safely flush the massive amounts of risperidone from his small body. We could not just stop the heavy antipsychotic medication cold turkey without risking severe neurological withdrawal symptoms. Eris slowly tapered the dosage down over several agonizing weeks. During those first few weeks, Tommy experienced terrible night sweats, severe nausea, and painful muscle tremors. I spent countless nights sitting by his bedside, holding his small hand, wiping his forehead with a cool, damp cloth, and softly telling him stories about the massive houses I used to build. I promised him every single night that the darkness was leaving his body and that he would never have to take another poison pill again. Slowly but surely, the heavy chemical fog began to lift. The toxic residue was completely flushed from his liver, and his kidney functions returned to perfectly normal, healthy levels. As the poison left his system, the real Tommy began to emerge from the heavy shadow. The sluggishness disappeared entirely, replaced by the boundless kinetic energy of a normal 10-year-old boy. The dark, heavy circles under his brown eyes faded away, revealing a bright, curious spark that I had not seen in months. He started eating like a champion, asking for second helpings of my homemade meals. He began pulling his baseball glove out of the closet, dragging me into the backyard to play catch until the sun went down. One Saturday afternoon, as he threw a perfect fastball straight into my leather mitt, a massive, genuine smile broke across his face. He laughed a loud, clear, joyous sound that echoed through the trees. Hearing that laugh felt like a massive, heavy weight lifting completely off my chest. We started building a large, complex wooden treehouse together in the backyard, measuring the lumber and hammering the nails side by side. He was constantly asking me rapid-fire questions about structural engineering and architectural design. The brilliant, inquisitive boy who loved to learn how the world worked was officially back. The smiles returned to our daily lives, replacing the constant thick tension of the past year with a quiet, profound happiness. While Tommy healed, I worked aggressively alongside Richard Kaplan to completely seal every single financial vulnerability in my corporate empire. The fraudulent $3 million loan Megan had attempted to secure was entirely voided by the Federal Banking Commission the exact moment her massive forgery was exposed. My $30 million construction company remained completely debt-free and entirely under my absolute control. Richard executed a comprehensive overhaul of all my corporate security protocols, implementing strict multi-signature requirements and biometric authorizations for any future asset transfers. We completely restructured Tommy's $5 million trust fund, locking it behind an impenetrable, ironclad legal wall that no greedy relative could ever breach. As for Sylvia, the consequences of her choices had played out exactly as I predicted. The local mafia syndicate had seized all of her remaining personal assets, leaving her completely destitute and terrified on the streets. I felt absolutely no obligation to clean up her mess. Her financial ruin was the direct result of her own malicious gambling, and she was now entirely erased from my ledger. With my legacy completely secured and my grandson safe, I realized the sheer amount of wealth I possessed was meant for more than just building luxury homes and corporate warehouses. I looked at Tommy reading a book on the living room sofa, perfectly safe and healthy, and I thought about the thousands of other vulnerable children who did not have a grandfather with the resources to hire private investigators and elite lawyers. I instructed Richard to immediately liquidate 2 of my highest performing commercial properties, generating a massive influx of liquid capital. I took $3 million from that sale and established a highly funded private philanthropic foundation. The foundation was specifically designed to provide elite legal representation, private investigative resources, and emergency financial support for children trapped in severe domestic abuse and medical exploitation situations. I wanted to ensure that no ruthless predator could ever use a child as a financial hostage without facing the absolute crushing weight of justice. My wealth was no longer just a target for greedy parasites. It was now a lethal weapon actively deployed to protect the innocent. I drove the heavy wooden stake of the for sale sign deep into the perfectly manicured front lawn of my estate. The heavy thud of the steel hammer against the wood felt like the final nail in a coffin. I stood back and looked at the massive, sprawling brick house I had built with my own hands. For decades, I thought this structure was a fortress of safety for my family. I thought the expensive granite countertops, the custom hardwood floors, and the soaring vaulted ceilings were monuments to my success and my love. But as I walked through the empty, echoing halls one last time, I realized it was nothing more than a hollow shell. I walked past the formal dining room where Terrence and Megan had coldly calculated the destruction of their own son. I stepped into the kitchen, staring at the exact spot on the marble island where Sylvia had secretly crushed antipsychotic pills to pay off her underground gambling debts. The house was completely tainted. It was infected by their greed, their racism, and their absolute moral rot. The walls held no happy memories for me anymore. They only echoed with the sickening sounds of their hidden conversations and their treacherous lies. I did not want a single penny from the sale of this toxic property to enter my personal bank accounts. I had already instructed Richard Kaplan to funnel the entire proceeds directly into the new philanthropic foundation. I turned my back on the grand entryway, walking out the heavy mahogany front doors for the absolute last time. I locked the deadbolt, dropping the brass key into a padded envelope for the real estate agent. I was not leaving a home behind. I was abandoning a meticulously decorated crime scene. We did not move into another giant mansion in an elite gated community. I wanted absolute peace and unrestricted open air for my grandson. I purchased a sprawling, beautiful rustic farm on the quiet green outskirts of the county. The property featured a massive wrap-around wooden porch, a sturdy timber barn, and 50 acres of rolling emerald pastures framed by ancient oak trees. It was a place where a boy could actually breathe, where the air tasted clean and the nights were completely silent. The transformation in Tommy over the next few months was nothing short of miraculous. Without the heavy dark shadow of his toxic parents and the suffocating chemical fog of the risperidone, my grandson completely flourished. He was no longer the sluggish, pale ghost who dragged his feet through the hallways. He was a vibrant, loud, deeply curious 10-year-old force of nature. I watched him sprint across the thick green grass of our new backyard, his sneakers kicking up clumps of dirt as he chased our newly adopted golden retriever. His laughter was a constant, booming soundtrack to my days. The dark circles under his bright brown eyes were permanently erased, replaced by the healthy, rosy flush of a kid who spent his entire afternoon soaking in the sunshine. We spent hours out in the wide-open pasture. I bought him a brand-new leather baseball mitt, and we threw fastballs back and forth until my old shoulders ached. He would wind up his pitch, his face locked in intense, playful concentration, and launch the baseball straight into the center of my glove with a satisfying, loud pop. I would toss it back, challenging him to run faster and throw harder. We spent our weekends building model rockets, exploring the thick woods behind the barn, and learning how to properly fish in the large, sparkling pond on the edge of the property. He was thriving academically and socially, surrounded by genuine, unconditional support. I watched him pitch the baseball to me on a warm Tuesday afternoon, his face completely glowing with pure, unadulterated joy. He caught my return throw and shouted across the yard, telling me he wanted to be a structural engineer just like me when he grew up. He wanted to build things that would last forever. I looked at the incredible, bright young man standing in the sun, and I knew I had successfully saved the only piece of my legacy that actually mattered. He was safe, He was brilliant, and he was entirely free. I sat down heavily on the comfortable wooden rocking chair on my wraparound porch, letting the warm afternoon breeze wash over my face. I watched Tommy run toward the barn with the dog trailing happily behind him. The profound quiet of the farm offered me the time to deeply reflect on the horrific nightmare we had barely survived. For my entire life, I had firmly believed that blood was the ultimate unbreakable bond. I believed that sharing a last name and a genetic lineage automatically guaranteed loyalty, love, and mutual protection. I was incredibly foolish to hold on to that dangerous illusion for so long. The brutal reality of this world is that blood does not make a family. Blood is simply a biological accident of birth. True family is forged through unwavering loyalty, relentless protection, and the absolute refusal to betray the people who trust you. True family is the people who stand between you and the fire, not the ones who secretly strike the match. I had given Terrence, Megan, and Sylvia the entire world. I handed them unparalleled luxury, endless opportunities, and a fortress of financial security. But their souls were completely hollowed out by a ravenous, bottomless greed. They proved that no amount of money can ever fill the void of a morally bankrupt heart. Those who are willing to sell out their own flesh and blood for the promise of a larger bank account will always inevitably orchestrate their own absolute destruction. They built a fragile house of wicked lies, and when the truth finally struck, it collapsed entirely, crushing them under the heavy weight of their own monstrous choices. Megan is rotting in a federal prison, stripped of the arrogant supremacy she wielded like a weapon. Terrence is locked in a tiny cell broken by his own pathetic cowardice. Sylvia is destitute, cast out into the cold streets to face the violent consequences of her secret addictions. They traded their freedom, their family, and their humanity for a pile of stolen money they will never get to spend. They paid for their greed with their own lives. I leaned back in the rocking chair, the wooden runners creaking softly against the porch floorboards. I picked up a steaming mug of black coffee resting on the small side table. I took a slow, deep sip, letting the rich, bitter flavor coat my tongue. The sun was beginning to set over the rolling green pastures, painting the wide-open sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. I listened to the sound of my grandson laughing in the distance, a sound so pure and full of life that it completely drowned out the dark memories of the past. I rested the warm coffee mug on my knee, and a deep, genuine smile slowly spread across my face. The war was officially over. The monsters were permanently locked away, and we were finally completely at peace. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that constant vigilance is the ultimate price of peace. We often want to believe the absolute best about the people closest to us, brushing off clear warning signs because the truth is simply too painful to confront. But when the safety of an innocent child is on the line, you can never afford to ignore your gut instincts. Wealth and success mean absolutely nothing if they are built on a fragile foundation of blind trust. True strength is not just about having the power to build a massive empire. It is about having the profound courage to tear it down and expose the monsters hiding inside. If my story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and share your thoughts in the comments below, because your voice might just give someone else the strength to stand up and fight.